In a certain village in La Mancha, there lived a gentleman named Señor Alfonso Quixote. His household consisted of a housekeeper over 40, a niece not yet 20, and a lad for the field and market. Our gentleman was verging on 50, of tough constitution, lean-bodied, thin-faced, a great early riser and lover of hunting. This gentleman gave himself up to the reading of books of knight-errantry. He filled his mind with all that he read in them. In fact, he thought it fit and proper to turn errant and travel through the world with horse and armor in search of adventures, to win eternal honor and renown. He hurried to turn his desires into action. The first thing he did was to clean some ancestral armor. Next, he went to his hack, which was nothing but skin and bone. After much thought, he finally chose the name Rocinante for the hack, which seemed grand and sonorous. Having found so pleasing a name for the horse, he next did the same for himself. Finally, he resolved to call himself Don Quixote. Now that this was settled, there was nothing further required, except a lady to be in love with. For a knight-errant without a tender passion was like a tree without leaves or fruit, a body without a soul. "If by good fortune I encountered a giant," Don Quixote said to himself, "not unusual for knights-errant, and vanquish him and force him to surrender, should I not have a lady to whom I could send him as a present?" How delighted would our knight be when he found a mistress! It is said that in a neighboring village, called Toboso, there lived a peasant girl, Aldonza Lorenzo, whom our knight had once loved, though she neither knew nor cared about this. This, then, was the lady he chose to nominate as mistress of his heart. He thought of a name for her that should be suitable for a princess or great lady, and settled on Dulcinea del Toboso. Once these preparations were completed, he was anxious to wait no longer before putting his ideas into effect. Wearing this plain armor, our brand-new adventurer journeyed out of his village. At nightfall, he approached an inn, which to his addled mind he took to be a castle. The two young serving women there he took for maidens, and addressed them in high-flown language. But ignoring him, they served up his evening meal. Soon a hog-gelder arrived, and blew on his reed whistle, convincing Don Quixote that he was indeed in a castle, being entertained with music. At this particular time, what distressed him deeply was that he was not yet knighted. Taking the innkeeper aside, Don Quixote arranged to be knighted on the following morning. The landlord, being a shrewd fellow, was already doubtful about the sanity of his guest. However, he decided to humor him. He told him his request was very reasonable, and that the pursuits of knights-errants were but natural and suitable. He mentioned that he had, in his youth, followed that honorable profession, and travelled various parts of the world in search of adventures. He added that there was presently no chapel in his castle, since it was being rebuilt, but that he would perform the ceremonies of knighthood the following morning in the open courtyard. On asking whether the knight-to-be had any money, Don Quixote told him he had none, since no reference was made to this in the histories of knights-errant. The innkeeper commented that though the authors might not mention the subject, he would advise that Don Quixote always carried enough to cover the expenses of his travels. Don Quixote promised to follow his advice, and an order was given to him by the innkeeper to watch over his armor that night, as was the custom. Don Quixote collected it together and placed it on a cistern close to a well in the courtyard next to the inn. He then quietly paced up and down the courtyard, which was illuminated by the moon, as it was now pitch dark. Now one of the guests at the inn, a carrier, wanted to give his mule some water. To do so, he would have to remove the armor lying over the cistern. As he approached, Don Quixote cried out, "O rash knight, Do not touch that armor of the most valiant adventurer who ever wore a sword. Beware, unless you wish to lose your life." The carrier ignored the warning and threw the armor some feet away. Don Quixote raised his eyes to heaven and said, "Assist me, O Lady Dulcinea, to avenge this insult," and a number of other oaths in the same vein. Then he raised his lance and hit the carrier on the head, laying him out. This done, Don Quixote replaced his arm over the cistern and resumed his pacing up and down. Soon, however, another carrier wished to water his mules, and tried to remove the armor from its resting place. Once again Don Quixote laid him out. The noise brought out all the people from the inn. The friends of the wounded, seeing what had taken place, began to shower stones on Don Quixote, who tried as well as he could to shield himself, not daring to move from the cistern because he could not abandon his armor. Don Quixote called them all infamous traitors, and the innkeeper a coward for allowing a knight-errant to be treated in this manner. The innkeeper begged the carriers to stop their attack. Don Quixote allowed the wounded to be carried away, and then resumed his watch over the armor. The innkeeper took exception to his guest's pranks, and resolved on immediate knighthood. He went up to Don Quixote, and ordered him to kneel, and reading from a manual, which was in truth no more than the book he used to enter the carrier's accounts for straw and barley, requested one of the ladies to prepare Don Quixote's sword, and declared Don Quixote a knight. The ceremony completed, our knight was impatient to ride out in search of adventures. He had not gone very far when he heard what seemed a faint, complaining voice. He cried, "Thank heaven for granting me the opportunity to perform my duty. These cries come from a man or woman in distress, in need of my protection and assistance." He came across a youth tied to a tree, who was being struck with a belt by a country fellow. Don Quixote rebuked the man. "It does you no service to beat someone who is unable to defend himself. Get on your horse with your lance, and I will challenge you to combat." The peasant explained to this apparition, which he took to be some sort of corpse, "I employ this lad to tend sheep, but each day he loses one. Hence his punishment." Don Quixote considered this, but the lad protested that his master was a skinflint, using the excuse of the loss of his flocks as a reason for not paying him. Our knight demanded the boy's release and payment of arrears. The peasant agreed, leaving Don Quixote elated at his accomplishment. His next meeting was with a group of merchants, whom he took to be knights-errant. "Hold!" he demanded. "Let no one pass who does not confess that there is no one more beautiful as the Empress of La Mancha, the peerless Dulcinea del Toboso." The merchants believed him mad for this outburst, and one of them demanded a portrait of her, mockingly saying, "Even though her portrait might represent her with a squint in one eye and the other bloodshot, we are bound to agree." Don Quixote took exception to this, and ran forward to the man with his lance. Rocinante stumbled, pulling his master to the ground and breaking his lance in the process. A muleteer with the merchants couldn't resist the opportunity to rain blows on the unfortunate knight and poke him with the splinters of his lance. At last the merchants left. The stricken knight, his mind still full of romances, rolled over and over in an attempt to rise. At last a peasant from his village assisted him onto his ass, and set off towards the village with Rocinante tied behind, carrying the armor and the shattered lance. The peasant waited till nightfall before entering, wishing to avoid showing Don Quixote arriving in such a distressed and sorry state. On approaching his house, Don Quixote and the peasant heard his niece complaining to the village priest. "I must take the blame for not telling you of my uncle's obsession with those books of knight-errantry. They ought to be burnt." The priest agreed, and proclaimed a public inquisition before consigning the volumes to the flames. The peasant believed what he overheard, confirming the knight's madness, and cried aloud, "Open the doors to the wounded Signor Alonso!" Don Quixote was immediately put to bed, where he fell into a long sleep. Meanwhile, the priest and the housekeeper gathered up all his books and consigned them to the flames, walling up the room in which the books had been stored. After 2 days, our knight arose from his bed and searched for his library. Not finding it, he was informed that an enchanter had removed the books and the very fabric of the room in his absence. On hearing this, Don Quixote resolved to eventually discover and defeat this enchanter. However, for over 2 weeks, our knight remained settled, with little sign of repeating his recent adventures. During this time, he befriended a labourer, an honest but shallow-brained fellow. With promises and arguments, he persuaded the fellow, Sancho Panza, to accompany him as his squire. Don Quixote raised money for the adventure by pawning and selling his possessions, steadily making a loss. Soon the two were ready, with Sancho mounted on his ass, Dapple, and our knight equipped with armour, astride Rocinante. They set out on the same route as that of the first expedition, with Don Quixote promising Sancho governorship of an island, with his wife as queen. "I doubt she becomes the role of queen. The title of countess would be much better suited to her," commented Sancho. Whilst discussing the custom of knights-errant to award an island to govern to their squires, they saw on the plain before them 30 or 40 windmills. As soon as Don Quixote saw them, he said to his squire, "Fortune guides our affairs better than we ourselves could have wished. Look over there, friend Sancho Panza, where more than 30 giants stand. I intend to do battle with them, and with their spoils we will begin to grow rich. For it is lawful combat, and we will be doing God a good service by wiping so wicked a generation from the face of the earth." "What giants?" said Sancho. "Those over there," answered his master, "with their long arms, indeed. Some seem to be up to 2 leagues in length." "Look, sir," answered Sancho, "those objects over there are not giants. They're windmills, and what seems to be the arms are sails, which, moved by the wind, make the millstone turn." "It is evident," answered Don Quixote, "that you are not familiar with this business of adventures. They are indeed giants. If you are afraid, go to one side and pray, while I engage them in fierce and unequal battle." Saying this, he dug his spurs into his steed Rocinante, heedless of his squire's shouted warning, assuring him that they really were windmills, not giants. He was so utterly convinced, despite Sancho's cries, that they were giants. Even close to, he could not see what they were. Approaching, he cried out, "Do not fly, you cowards, vile creatures, for it is but a single knight who assaults you." The wind now rose a little, and the great sails began to move rapidly, at the sight of which Don Quixote shouted, "Although you have more arms than the giant Briarens, you shall pay for it." Saying this, he commended himself devoutly to his lady Dulcinea, asking her to aid him in the present crisis. Covering himself with his shield, and setting his lance in the rest, he urged Rocinante forward at full gallop, and attacked the nearest mill. Having thrust his lance into the sail, the wind turned it with such violence that it broke the lance in splinters, dragging the horse and rider after it, tumbling over and over on the plain, injuring both badly. Sancho Panza rushed to Don Quixote's assistance as fast as his ass Dapple could trot. When he came up, he found the knight unable to move, so violent was the blow which he and Rocinante had received in their fall. "Good Lord!" cried Sancho. "Did I not warn you to take care, saying they were only windmills? No one could mistake them,
unless he had windmills on the brain."
"Peace, friend Sancho," answered Don Quixote. "Matters of war are, more than anything, subject to continual changes of fortune. Now I truly believe that the same enchanter who stole my library and books has changed these giants into windmills, with the intention of depriving me of the glory of overcoming them, so great is the dislike he has for me. But his black arts will finally count for little against the goodness of my sword."
"God grant that be the case,"
answered Sancho, bewildered. Then he helped his master get up, and placed him back onto his horse. They passed the night under some trees, from which our knight tore down a branch to serve him as some sort of lance, and stuck it into the iron head of the one that had been broken. The following morning they set off towards the pass of La Piche, discussing the subject of Sancho Panza's position as companion. In the middle of this conversation, 2 monks on mules appeared on the road, and behind them a coach, horsemen, and 2 muleteers. Don Quixote, seeing them from a distance, said, "Those 2 dark shapes looming up must beyond all doubt be enchanters bearing off some princess. It is my duty to redress this wrong." On approaching closer, Don Quixote cried out, "No clever speeches for me! I know what you are up to, scoundrels!" The first monk was unseated by Don Quixote's lance, and Sancho Panza ran up and started stripping him of his clothes. He felt it right to have a share of the spoils of the battle, which his master had won. The monk's servants came up and fought with Sancho, whilst Don Quixote talked with the lady in the coach. "Your fair ladyship may now dispose of yourself as you desire, since the pride of your ravishers lies in the dust." He declared himself a knight, captivated by the beautiful Lady Dulcinea. One of the horsemen, a basque, accompanying the coach, addressed him. "Get along, you ill-gotten knight! I shall kill you if you do not leave the coach." The 2 immediately fought. The lady in the coach made the coachman drive off a little way to better watch the struggle. Don Quixote rushed at the basque with sword aloft. However, the first blow from the basque left our knight disarmed, taking out both a piece of his helmet and left ear. The raging knight returned the blow, and the basque fell from his horse. Don Quixote pursued the basque, and with sword held aloft between his enemy's eyes, demanded surrender. The lady begged that her squire's life be spared. Don Quixote replied, "Certainly, fair lady, on condition that this knight will promise to present himself before the Lady Dulcinea, so that she may deal with him according to her pleasure." Once more the 2 set off. Sancho asked, "When it is convenient, my lord Don Quixote, bestow on me the government of that island you have won in this battle." "Brother Sancho, this adventure and others like it is not, I am afraid, one of islands, but only of crossroads, with no gain but injury. Have patience." Entering a wood, they sought shelter. The best, however, were some goatherd huts, to which they were welcomed. They were supplied with food by the goatherds, including acorns and cheese. Don Quixote took up some of the acorns and lamented the passing of the golden age of knights, of which they reminded him. "Happy times, happy ages. In that blessed age all things were in harmony, and all was peace.
As times became worse, the order of knight-errantry was instituted, unknown to you.
Here he turned to the goatherds.
I am of this order, and I thank you for your hospitality.
Following the time spent with the goatherds, Don Quixote and his squire entered a wood. As a result of the hot sun, they had been looking and found a refreshing brook. Dismounting, Don Quixote and Sancho left the ass and Rocinante to feed. Nearby was a herd of Galician mares, and soon Rocinante was fighting with them. These gave the poor hack such a beating with their hooves and teeth that his girths were broken and saddle removed. On their return, the carriers, to whom the mares belonged, fixed the blame on Rocinante for the violence done to their mares, and beat him, leaving him in a very sorry state. Don Quixote, temper roused, eyed the carriers menacingly and declared, I am equal to 100, ignoring Sancho's words of caution. He strode into the group, soon joined by Sancho, striking out at them. The carriers, seeing so many of themselves roughly treated by the two, laid into them until Sancho and Don Quixote lay stretched out on the ground. On recovering, Don Quixote regaled Sancho. You must realize that a knight-errant's life is subject to countless perils and mischances. Remember, wounds received in battle are in fact a source of honor rather than a source of dishonor. Sancho raised himself in spite of the pain and harnessed his ass. He settled his master on Dapple, and tying Rocinante to his tail, led the beast by the halter. No more than 2 miles out, they came to a road on which Sancho sighted an inn, which to Don Quixote, of course, seemed to be a castle. The innkeeper's wife was kindly by nature, and felt sorry for her visitor's misfortunes. She bandaged up Don Quixote, remarking that he must have had a beating, rather than the fall he had claimed. It wasn't a beating, said Sancho, but a rock on which he fell. I got such a shock from seeing my master tumble, I too felt as though I'd been beaten black and blue. Another guest of the inn, a carrier, watched the maid closely for any sign of betrayal, since he had a certain understanding with her. That night, in a fanciful invention, Don Quixote saw the maid as a test to his honor. While in this state of mind, the maid entered the garret in which the three slept, groping for the hand of her lover, the carrier. In his confused state, Don Quixote seized her as she passed. When the carrier saw the struggle, he felt deceived. He dealt the knight a terrible blow, and trampled all over him. Unable to bear this extra weight, the bed gave way with a great crash. The innkeeper aroused the other guests with a cry of alarm. At this, the brawl stopped. Later inspection revealed the sadly aching bones and bruised limbs of our knight. Don Quixote mixed a balsam remedy, and upon drinking this soothing mixture, slept soundly for several hours. On awaking, he thought himself cured of all his pains, and, with such a remedy, able to undertake any peril without fear. The knight and squire prepared to depart. The innkeeper pressed them for payment for their stay. Don Quixote dismissed the request, replying, Then I have been in error, for truly I thought it was a castle in which we stayed. The innkeeper mocked his fancies as a knight-errant. At this, Don Quixote brandished his sword and fled from the inn. Sancho, too, refused to pay and followed his master. 4 guests, amused by this turn of events, decided to play a prank upon the squire. They went out and pulled Sancho from his ass and tossed him in a blanket while the innkeeper took the saddlebags from Dapple in payment. Don Quixote looked on helplessly, being unable to dismount from Rocinante because of his bruises. Don Quixote dismissed the episode by declaring the inn enchanted. I am more than ever convinced of this, because when I stood at the barriers in the courtyard, I could not get over them. He then noticed dust rising along the road ahead, which he took to be an army.
"If so, there must be two armies," remarked Sancho, "for on this side arises just such a cloud of dust. We must seek out the weaker side to assist," decided Don Quixote.
Had it not been for the dust, the armies would have been seen for what they were, 2 flocks of sheep. However, Don Quixote pressed forward, imagining knights from many provinces, taking the bleats of ewes to be the horns and trumpets of battle. Sancho took to a hillock, and observed his master attacking the flocks. On his approach, the shepherds immediately showered Don Quixote with stones, laying the knight out, wounded. Alarmed, the shepherds gathered their flocks and fled. Don Quixote and Sancho Panza set off, and since they moved slowly, night overtook them. Worse still, once more they were famished, having lost their provisions earlier. Advancing towards them, they made out many lights.
"Sancho, this must be a most perilous adventure. Whatever these phantoms are, I feel free to attack."
The procession consisted of about 20 figures dressed in white robes, carrying torches, and behind them a litter, with 6 mourners on mules. At this sight, Sancho's courage left him. Don Quixote demanded that the procession halt.
"From what I see, knights, either you have done injury, or injury has been done to you, which must be avenged."
One of those in the procession explained that they were in a hurry, and asked that our knight should not delay them. Don Quixote's anger was aroused at the rebuke, and he chased the unwilling combatants from the field. Approaching one of the company who was left injured on the ground, he demanded,
"What mischief brought you here, ecclesiastic?"
"We came to bury this dead man in his tomb in Segovia, his native town."
"Why, then, did you delay in telling me?"
demanded Don Quixote. He and Sancho conveyed their apologies for their assault, but still took away the food that was loaded on a mule. Back on the trail, Don Quixote, seeing Sancho's melancholy mood, said to him,
"All these squalls which greet us are signs that the weather will soon clear, and things will go well with us. Knights errant knew and have to know everything, so trust my judgment."
Late in the day, Sancho turned in the direction in which he thought they might find lodging. This took them between 2 great hills, and whilst they had food for their rest, they had no wine nor even water to drink. Sancho noted the fresh green grass in the meadow.
"We might find a spring or brook nearby, to judge from this grass."
At nightfall, they heard the sound of a roaring waterfall. But that was not all. There was also a fearful din of chains and mighty strokes. Don Quixote determined to discover who this dreadful foe was. Sancho hesitated, being afraid.
"Never let it be said now, or at any time, that tears or entreaties stopped me from performing the duty of a knight,"
stated Don Quixote. Sancho, now desperate, managed to tie Rocinante's forelegs together, thereby preventing our knight's departure. At last they resolved to rest the night, and look for the source of the terrible noise in the morning. At daybreak, leaving Sancho, Don Quixote departed to find the source of the noise of the water, chains, and strokes. Sancho followed on foot. At the base of some rocks, near the waterfall, lay some huts, and approaching closer, they saw 6 fulling hammers, whose strokes produced that hideous din. The squire and his master burst out laughing.
"You know, friend Sancho, that I was born in our age of iron, to revive in it the age of gold.
I am someone for whom are reserved dangers, exploits, and courageous achievements."
Sancho was much amused. Don Quixote took exception to his mirth, and hit Sancho twice with his lance. Our knight complained that, unlike the squires of knights errant in books, Sancho paid him little respect. Later in the morning it began to rain a little, and the sound of the mills could now only be faintly heard. They had not gone much further before Don Quixote caught sight of a man on a horse, with something on his head which shone like gold.
"Why, that is Mambrino's helmet!" exclaimed Don Quixote, referring to a great warrior. In reality, the man was a barber and apothecary, out serving the needs of a neighbouring village to his own, which had neither barber nor apothecary. Fearing that his new hat might get soiled when it began to rain, he had put the basin on his head. As it was clean, it shone from nearly a mile away. The knight lay in wait for the unfortunate horseman. "Defend yourself or surrender of your own free will what is so rightfully mine," he challenged. The barber took fright at this apparition, leaving the basin on the ground. Sancho retrieved the basin and gave it to his master, who placed it on his head. He turned it round to find the visor, complaining, "The pagan for whom this helmet was first shaped must have had an enormous head, and the worst of it is that one half of it is missing." Sancho laughed aloud until he remembered his master's quick temper. Don Quixote raised his eyes and saw on the road some 24 men on foot, strung by the neck on a great iron chain, and manacled together. 4 guards were with them. "Here's a chain gang of galley slaves, men forced into the service of the king, going to serve in the galleys," observed Sancho. "Then," said his master, "this is clearly an opportunity for redressing wrongs and assisting the wretched." "Consider, your worship," said Sancho, "that the king, as chief justice, is only punishing them for their crimes." "That may be," replied Don Quixote. "I should, however, like to learn from each of these men the cause of his misfortune." With permission from the guards, Don Quixote set about questioning the slaves one by one. He expressed surprise at the adversities which had been the cause of the sentence which had fallen on them. After a time, the guard became impatient at the delay caused. "Let's get along now, for this has become too much of a joke." Addressing the whole chain gang, the knight declared, "From all you told me, you are being punished by the unfair decisions of the judge. I am forced to demonstrate the purpose for which I vowed to succor the needy and those oppressed by the strong." "This is utter foolishness," replied the guard. "You would like us to set the convicts free. Put that basin back on your head, you joker, and get along with you." "You are a rat and a rascal," retorted Don Quixote. He then attacked the guard, seriously wounding him with his lance. In the ensuing confusion, the slaves made good their escape, and the guards fled. Sancho was much upset at this business, for he guessed that the guards would report the matter to the Holy Brotherhood and come in pursuit of them. One of the slaves, Pasamonte, was convinced that Don Quixote's actions proved he was not right in the head. With a signal to his companions, they showered Don Quixote, Sancho, Rocinante, and Dapple with stones. In a battered state, the unfortunates were then stripped of their possessions. Don Quixote counseled patience and courage in adversity. He then mounted Rocinante silently, and with Sancho leading the way on Dapple, rode into the Sierra Morena mountains. After dawn on the following day, they saw a bundle on the track.
Sancho looked in it and found some fine shirts and a hoard of gold coins. On further inspection, he also found a little notebook, which was richly decorated, and passed it over to his master. On reading a passage from it, Don Quixote exclaimed, "From its beginning, this seems like a love letter." Immediately the knight had a great desire to make the acquaintance of the owner of the bundle, imagining a lover of some consequence, and he resolved to look for him. Sancho cautioned, "It would be better not to look for him." His master argued against him, and when they had rounded the mountain, they found a dead mule, a further piece of evidence. An old goatherd appeared, and was questioned.
"All I can say is that a youth on a mule arrived 6 months ago and disappeared. However, he recently returned in an unkempt state, robbed one of my boys, and once again fled back into the mountains."
Our knight was more anxious than ever to discover who this man was, and resolved to search the hillside. By chance the youth appeared, and was given a fine reception by our knight. "My only wish is to serve you," he exclaimed. The young madman, the ill-fated king of the mountains, as he was known, requested food. The request was quickly granted, and Cardenio, for that was his name, related his story. "I loved and adored Lucinda, as well-born and rich as any in my family. I wished to marry her, and asked her father if I might. He agreed, but quite correctly thought I should ask my own father's permission in turn. So I went to my father. When I arrived, he had a letter in his hand from the Duke of Picado, a grandee. The Duke had proposed that I become the companion for his eldest son. My father had agreed, and fixed my departure for 2 days later. Before leaving, I asked Lucinda to wait for me, and her father to promise her to no other until my return. In this way I came into the service of the Duke of Picado. In due course, his son, Don Fernando, my companion, fell in love with a country girl, Dorothea, and decided to marry her. Knowing that his father was unlikely to approve the match, I decided to tell the Duke. Before I could do so, however, Don Fernando suggested that we visit my father, saying that the absence might cure his infatuation. I wholeheartedly agreed, since this offered me the chance to see Lucinda again. Unknown to me at the time, Don Fernando had in fact already married Dorothea. While on our visit, Don Fernando became interested in Lucinda and wanted to meet her. This was arranged, and he fell in love with her. At this point, Don Quixote chose to interrupt, accusing the unfortunate of villainous calumny. The youth reacted violently to this unprovoked attack, felling the knight with a rock. Even with the assistance of Sancho and the goatherd, all three were left bruised and battered. The madman retreated into the mountains. Don Quixote resolved a penance. He and Sancho left the goatherd and made their way on a most difficult track in the mountains, remaining silent throughout the journey. At last Sancho spoke.
"Señor, give me your blessing and allow me to return home to my wife and children. Your resolution to remain silent is making things very difficult, particularly in this present terrain which is devoid of inhabitants."
"I understand, Sancho," replied Don Quixote. "I shall give up my vow of silence."
"What does your worship really intend to do in a place as remote as this?"
"I intend to imitate the heroes Amadis and Don Orlando. However, I've no intention of committing any of the hideous deeds which they needed to redress with a penance."
"It seems that these knights who you mention had, because of the terrible things they had done, good reason for their penance. But why do you need to go mad?
Oh, that's not the point. A knight-errant who runs mad and undertakes his penance with just cause receives no thanks. However, to do so without reason demonstrates to my lady how I would act if I did have cause. Tell me, by the way, have you taken care of Mambrino's helmet?
Sancho answered,
As God lives, sir, knight of the sorrowful countenance, I'm stunned at some of what you say. It makes me think that all you tell me of chivalry, winning kingdoms and empires, and the rest must be a matter of friction or fiction or whatever you call it. For since you persist in believing a barber's basin to be Mambrino's helmet, what else can I think?
Take care of the helmet, Sancho, said the knight. I need to strip off all my armour, and if I am to imitate Orlando in my penance, remain naked.
At this point they came to the foot of a mountain, rising sheer above a small meadow, with a stream running through it. Here Don Quixote decided to undertake his penance. Dismounting, he took the harness off Rocinante, and slapping the horse on the hind quarters, set him free. Sancho watched this, and commented,
Master, if Dapple were here, I would not have agreed to his being unsaddled and set free. It would be advisable if you re-harness Rocinante. If I have to leave here, I would have to walk. In truth, I'm a poor walker, so I don't know how I'll go back and forth.
Oh, do as you wish, replied our knight. I approve of your proposal. You will leave within 3 days. Meanwhile, I would like you to witness what I say for my lady, and you can report it to Dulcinea accordingly.
What else is there to see, beyond what I have already seen?
asked Sancho.
I now have to tear my garments, wave my arms about, and dash my head against these rocks.
Heavens above!
exclaimed Sancho.
Be careful how you give yourself these blows, for you may put an end to yourself and any possibility of further penance. If you really consider knocks on the head necessary, why don't you say, run your head against water or something soft? Then leave it to me to tell your lady that you struck your head against a rock which was harder than diamond.
Thanks for the well-intentioned advice, Sancho, but I'll carry this out in earnest, otherwise the penance will not be in accordance with the rules of chivalry. To resolve to do one thing and then do something quite different is the same as lying. It will be necessary to have some lint for the wounds, since we lost the balsam.
It was worse to lose the ass, commented Sancho. As for the 3 days, why should I not take your actions for granted? I'll tell wonders to your lady. Why not write a letter and send me off? In that way I'll be back sooner to end your purgatory.
That's true. But how will we write the letter? We have no paper. Perhaps we could do as the ancients did, and write on the leaves of trees, or on tablets of wax, though these will be as difficult to find as paper at present. Now I remember, it may be as well to use Cardenio's notebook. If you take good care of it, the letter can then be copied. There's no need for a signature, since the letters of the hero Amadis were sent unsigned.
Stepping to one side, Don Quixote, with great concentration, composed the letter as follows.
High and sovereign lady, sweetest Dulcinea del Toboso, he who is wounded by the dagger of absence and pierced with the arrows of love, sends greetings for your good health. If you continue to scorn me with your beauty, and follow me with your disdain, I shall be unable to support my affliction for you, which is severe and lasting. My dear Sancho,
will tell you of the state in which I am reduced on your account. If it is your wish to assist me, I am yours. If not, do as you think fit, for my death will make an end of your cruelty and my passion for the rest of your days. The Knight of the Sorrowful Countenance. Sancho took the letter, cut some broom to mark his path, and set off on Rocinante with his master's blessing. Don Quixote, in an anxious state, stripped off his breeches, and, naked, returned to his penance. On approaching a familiar inn, Sancho was greeted by the priest and barber from his own village. "Friend Sancho, where did you leave your master?" called the priest. Sancho told them of the mood in which he had left his master, the adventures that had befallen them, and the letter he was now taking to the Lady Dulcinea. The priest asked to see the letter.
"I've lost the notebook which had the letter to Dulcinea in it,"
admitted Sancho.
"Repeat it then, and we'll write it down," said the priest.
Sancho did so in his own fashion, and the pair were greatly amused by it. After a discussion on Don Quixote's condition, the priest and barber proposed a plan to entice him down from the mountains. The innkeeper's wife provided them with appropriate bearded disguises. They explained to Sancho that, should his master ask him about the letter, he must say that Dulcinea replied that she could not read, but commanded that he come to see her immediately. The priest and the barber set off, and, once in the mountains, encountered the mad youth Cardenio, who continued his tale from where Don Quixote had interrupted him.
"Don Fernando wished to remove me from the scene, so he arranged for me to see his brother to collect a number of horses. Meanwhile, he promised to intercede with my father for the hand of Lucinda on my behalf. Lucinda urged me to be quick, but the commission took 8 days to complete. Within 4 days I received a letter from Lucinda. She told me how, rather than intercede for me, Don Fernando had treacherously asked her father for her hand. He had agreed, seeing the advantage to be gained from such a match, and fixed the wedding day for 2 days' time. I rushed back just in time for the ceremony. I concealed myself in a recess in a window in the chapel. From there, at the moment when I heard the priest pronounce, 'Will you, Señora Lucinda, take Don Fernando to be your lawful husband?' I reminded Lucinda of her promise to me, but it was of no use, since she proceeded with the match, though she fainted on kissing the groom. I left the chapel, sought this barren region, in order that I might live out the rest of my days undisturbed." Suddenly they heard a lamenting voice. Leaving Cardenio, the priest and barber searched out the source, and came across a lad seated under a tree. But their eyes deceived them, for a lovely maiden looked up on hearing them approach. They inquired what circumstances had brought her there. "My name is Dorothea. My parents worked for a grandee, and I worked in the management of the household. One of the sons, Don Fernando, had a great affection for me. One night he managed to gain entry to my father's house and declared himself to me, promising marriage. Soon I had become his wife. However, one day he left me, and I waited months for his return. Then I heard that he had married a beautiful young lady named Lucinda. With a servant as companion, and disguised as a shepherd, I set out to find Don Fernando. I reached the town where he had married, and made inquiries after Lucinda. I was told of the wedding and Lucinda's fainting. It was said that a letter on her revealed that she had only agreed to the marriage out of duty, and that her heart really belonged to one Cardenio.
On learning this, Don Fernando had left her. While I was finding out all this, however, I had news that I was being searched for. I decided to flee and took refuge in these mountains, pretending to be a shepherd. However, my companion tried to take advantage of me, but with heaven's favor, I was able to cast him over a precipice. My present master, a shepherd, equally well saw through my disguise, and I am once more forced to flee.
The barber told her what had brought the priest and himself there, described Don Quixote's madness, and said that they were waiting for the return of the knight's squire, Sancho Panza. They then told her of their plan for taking the knight home. Dorothea remarked that she could easily play the part of the damsel in distress far better than the barber. She mounted the priest's mule, and also waited for Sancho. When he arrived, they set off to find Don Quixote. At length they found him, and Dorothea fell at his knees, pledging herself to him. "I will not give you a word in answer, nor hear anything more of your plight, until you rise from the ground," responded Don Quixote, and forced her to rise. Dorothea begged Don Quixote to come away with her that instant. The barber and the priest assured Don Quixote that Dorothea was indeed a princess. Having delivered his report, Sancho took exception to his master's refusal of his invited offer of love and marriage to Dulcinea. At this, our knight's temper rose, and he knocked down his squire. Dorothea cried out and calmed the situation, proposing that they should start their journey without further delay. While Don Quixote and Sancho Panza were engaged in conversation, smoothing over their differences, the priest congratulated Dorothea on her ingenuity in telling her story. Don Quixote returned to the matter of the letter.
"Dulcinea didn't read the letter," explained Sancho, "for she could neither read or write."
"Did she not then, as is the custom of ladies when receiving news, reward you with a rich jewel for her knight-errant ingratitude at the news?"
"Nowadays, it seems the custom is just to give bread and cheese, since that is all the Lady Dulcinea gave me."
"She is generous in the extreme," remarked Don Quixote. "While I think of it, you advised me to marry so that I might be a lord with the means to grant you favors. I will make it a condition of my marriage that before I go into battle I shall be given part of a country to bestow on you."
"Well, that's fair enough, but make it a coast, so that I might easily move if it is not to my liking," replied Sancho.
The motley band made their way back to the inn. The barber gave up his bearded disguise, as did the priest, their task accomplished. Don Quixote retired to the loft to rest a while. During supper, the company discussed Don Quixote's derangement, and put it down to the reading of books of knight-errantry. "In my opinion, there is no better reading," argued the landlord. The priest disagreed, proclaiming that knights-errant were now out of fashion. Chivalry was nonsense, and that what was said by the landlord was a pack of lies, a view which much distressed Sancho. The priest took up one of the books and began reading aloud, pointing out the ridiculousness of the tale. At this point Sancho withdrew to look in on his master. As the priest came towards the end of the tale he was reading, Sancho burst back in on the company, proclaiming that Don Quixote had sliced the head off the Lady Dulcinea's enemy. After closer inspection of the blood-stained loft, the innkeeper exclaimed, "Good God! Don Quixote has slashed the skins of red wine at the head of his bed!" Indeed, the battle with the giant was only another of the knight's fanciful dreams. The innkeeper demanded payment for the damage and his hospitality, notwithstanding Don Quixote's claim to privileges as a knight. The innkeeper's wife supported her husband's demands
and berated Sancho for the ill wind he brought with him. The priest offered to settle the bill, while Dorothea consoled the distressed Sancho, promising him the best position once she had regained her kingdom. The priest had once more turned to reading the book of knight-errantry, but was again interrupted, this time by 4 cavaliers and a masked lady. Before their arrival, Cardenio had retired to his room, which adjoined the main area. The masked lady was soon seated near his door, where she sighed to herself. Dorothea, concerned, asked if she might help, but the lady remained silent. She was only prompted to speak when the leading cavalier asserted that whatever the lady said was only lies. "That is not so," responded the lady, loudly and angrily. "It is because of my dislike of falsehood that I am so wretched." In his room nearby, Cardenio recognized the voice as that of Lucinda. When he rushed in, the lady felt faint on seeing him, a mask falling from her face. Don Fernando joined the group and was shocked to see his wife with Cardenio. Lucinda cried, "Let me go, my lord. You know well that nothing can shake my pledge to Cardenio, from whom I have been separated so long." By this time, Dorothea had recognized Don Fernando, and pledged herself to him. "You have overcome me, fair Dorothea," he exclaimed. "There is no denying you." In his turn, Cardenio pledged himself to Lucinda, who responded, "Oh, Cardenio, I am forever yours." Each told their stories, Don Fernando explaining that he had traced Lucinda to a convent, and, accompanied by the 3 other cavaliers, had carried her off. Sancho, seeing all this happen, expressed his disappointment at the changes that had taken place. Don Quixote had now risen, and had come to the conclusion that everything that had happened in the inn was due to enchantment. "Give me my clothes," he ordered Sancho, "and let me see these changes and transformations you speak of." He came out, and, staring intently at Dorothea, said, "I am told that rather than being a princess and a great lady, you have been turned into a humble maiden. I offer my services to take off the head of the enemy who has taken both your country and position." "Whoever told you that I was changed did not tell the truth. It is true that fortunate events, far beyond my hopes, have taken place, but I am as I have always been. Let us prepare to leave tomorrow." Don Quixote and Don Fernando exchanged compliments, and offered their services to each other. They were interrupted by the arrival of a captive and a lady in Moorish dress. The captive, who was called Captain Corrida, explained, "We have recently escaped from Algiers, where I was imprisoned, having been saved by this lady, who provided both my ransom and a vessel in which to escape. She has given up high rank in her country to marry me." Once the pair had settled in, and dinner was finished, the captive Corrida told a series of stirring adventures. When he had finished, Don Fernando commented, "Your strange tales have been as remarkable as any, and since we enjoyed them so much, we would like to hear them all over again in the morning." By this time, night had fallen. A coach, with a judge of the high courts of Mexico and a young lady as passenger, had arrived. The priest started to retell Corrida's tales to the new arrivals. The judge gave a deep sigh at the end of the telling. "I am certain this brave captain you speak of is my eldest brother." The whole company was delighted at the captain's good fortune in finding his brother once more, and Corrida, as soon as he saw the judge, was certain that he was indeed his brother, and soon this was confirmed. The judge explained that he was going to the Indies, and that his young companion, Clara, was his daughter, who had recently been left a large inheritance by her mother. just before daybreak, the ladies were awakened by a sweet song. Clara was much upset by it, and Dorothea asked the reason. "The singer, Don Luis, is the son of a gentleman from the kingdom of Aragon, who lived opposite us in Madrid. The young man fell in love with me and wanted us to marry. But as I am not yet 16, it is impossible." Dorothea smiled at Donna Clara's childish views and urged her to go back to sleep. Don Quixote had promised to keep guard outside. Everyone was now back asleep, except the innkeeper's daughter and her maid Martinez. The pair decided to play a trick on Don Quixote, and the innkeeper's daughter settled herself at the opening in the straw loft, sending Martinez out to the courtyard below. They heard Don Quixote sighing and reciting verses to his lady Dulcinea. The innkeeper's daughter drew Don Quixote's attention to a figure outside. Our knight imagined that a damsel in distress, overwhelmed by love for him, had come to seek his favours. He went towards the figure. "Pardon me, dear lady. Please return to your bed. Do not give me any further hint of your intentions, and thereby make me appear any more ungrateful."
"Sir," said Martinez, "I have come from my mistress, who wants no favour other than to feel one of your beautiful hands."
Don Quixote mounted Rocinante in order to reach the opening of the loft, where Martinez explained her mistress waited. Meanwhile, Martinez ran down to the stable and fetched the halter from Sancho's ass, rejoining her mistress in the loft. "Accept, madam, this hand, which a woman has never before touched." Saying this, Don Quixote held up his hand. Martinez then tied one end of the halter to Don Quixote's wrist, and fixed the other to the hatch in the hayloft door. Don Quixote, seeing his predicament, concluded that it was more enchantment. He tried every means to free himself, but considered himself stuck forever. At daybreak, 4 horsemen arrived in pursuit of Don Luis. Not finding the door open, they called out and knocked hard. Don Quixote urged them to stop knocking at the gate of the castle. One of them began to make fun of Don Quixote, while the others resumed their knocking, more loudly than before. At this moment, one of the travellers' horses chose to investigate Rocinante. Rocinante stirred, and in an instant Don Quixote was out of his saddle and dangling by the unwanted halter. At this point, Martinez, feeling sorry for the knight, slipped the knot and brought Don Quixote sharply to the ground. Don Quixote shouted out to try to regain entry to the inn, and by doing so woke the entire household. He declared himself enchanted, and threatened any guest who chose to ignore his claims as knight-errant. By now, all of Don Luis's pursuers had entered the inn. The 4 travellers sought out Don Luis. "You must instantly return home. Your father is greatly upset at your absence." Don Luis declined, but one of the travellers turned to the judge, saying, "Do you not recognize this gentleman? He is your neighbour's son, and has run away." The judge questioned Don Luis. "What reason do you have to run away in such an unbecoming disguise?" At first Don Luis was unable to answer, but then confessed his love for Donna Clara. The judge said he would consider what might be done, and for the moment both he and his servants could stay where they were. Now it happened that the barber from whom Don Quixote had acquired the helmet and Sancho Dapple's harness arrived. He attacked Sancho at once. "I've got you now, thief! Return my basin, saddle, and harness!" Don Quixote parted the two, demanding that the harness and saddle be laid out of view until the truth of ownership was resolved. A vote was taken by Don Fernando. He proclaimed Don Quixote to be mistaken. "You claim this to be a pack-ass's saddle, yet it is the saddle of a thoroughbred horse. You have proved your case very badly." One of Don Luis's servants fully agreed with Don Fernando.
"You lie, base villain," answered our knight, and aimed a blow at the servant's head with his lance. Uproar ensued. Don Quixote remained convinced that the basin was a helmet, the pack-saddle his harness, and the inn a castle. The judge and priest intervened to calm everyone down. Then one of the officers of the Holy Brotherhood, pursuing Don Louis, suddenly remembered that among the warrants he was carrying was one for the arrest of Don Quixote. He took it out and read it slowly. The priest examined the warrant and saw that the description given matched that of our knight. Don Quixote protested his innocence as knight-errant. The priest managed to persuade the horseman that Don Quixote was plainly mad, and asked that he be surrendered to his care. The barber's dispute was settled by the judge. The barber was paid off by the priest for the basin, the innkeeper was paid for Don Quixote's account by Don Fernando, and Don Louis agreed to return home. When all was done, Don Quixote expressed a wish to continue his journey, accompanied by Dorothea. "Let our departure be immediate."
Sancho turned on Dorothea.
"You are no more a princess than my mother, and if you were the lady you claim to be, you wouldn't go around kissing one of this company at every opportunity."
Don Quixote was furious at these remarks. "Do not be upset at the idle words that your squire has spoken. It seems that by some devilish illusion he may have seen what he claims," replied Dorothea. The priest and barber, concerned that Don Quixote might yet cause further trouble, hatched a plan for his departure. When he was asleep, they went outside, and having bought a wagon, constructed a cage of it. Then, once more assuming disguises, they tied up the sleeping knight and bundled him into the cage. When Don Quixote awoke, he protested, but the barber proclaimed,
"O knight of the sorrowful countenance, do not be upset at your confinement, for you will very quickly find yourself so exalted and ennobled that you will not know yourself."
Don Quixote was consoled, foreseeing himself married to his beloved Dulcinea, to the everlasting glory of La Mancha, although he did point out,
"I have read many histories of knights-errant, but cannot recall them being carried off in such a strange fashion."
The procession soon set off. En route, a canon joined them, and the priest explained,
"The knight Don Quixote de la Mancha is travelling under a spell."
The canon conversed with our knight upon matters of chivalry, and eventually suggested that this great interest in books of deeds by knights-errant might have addled Don Quixote's brain.
"Why, in my opinion, it is you that are deranged and enchanted," replied Don Quixote, "for daring to blaspheme against such an institution."
A little while later they stopped to eat. They were interrupted during their meal by a goatherd chasing a beautiful she-goat which had strayed. The goatherd explained,
"Do not think me a fool for talking to the animal. I know the difference between conversing with beasts and with men."
The priest acknowledged that the mountains bred learned men. The goatherd said that at least it bred men of experience, and entertained the company with a tale in which his sweetheart had been taken by a soldier of fortune, who had made a great impression by his appearance. But once he had captured her heart and relieved her of her fortune, she was abandoned and forced to enter a nunnery. At the end of his tale, looking at Don Quixote, the goatherd asked who the strange man was.
"Why, the famous Don Quixote, redresser of injuries, righter of wrongs, protector of damsels, terror of giants, and victor of battles."
The goatherd replied,
"Either you are joking, or the gentleman must have some rooms in his brain vacant."
Don Quixote took exception to this remark, and by way of evening the score, called the goatherd a whore's daughter and hit him with a loaf. Annoyed, the goatherd jumped at Don Quixote, and the struggle between the two was only stopped by the sound of a horn, and the approach of a procession. The procession was of villagers carrying the Madonna on a litter, beseeching relief from the long drought. However, Don Quixote imagined it was a band of villains abducting a noble lady. Sancho could not stop his master. Don Quixote approached the procession, demanding the release of the beautiful lady. "I will not consent to your advancing one step further unless you give her the liberty she so desires and deserves." The crowd laughed at his madness. In a rage he attacked the litter, but was beaten off by one of the peasants, being left senseless on the ground. All Don Quixote's party came up. Sancho threw himself upon his senseless master, believing him to be dead, pouring forth a tearful lamentation. His squire's grief brought our knight to his senses. On recovering consciousness, Don Quixote listed his injuries, concluding that a return to his village would, as Sancho suggested, be prudent. He was once again placed in the cart. The goatherd, the troopers, and the canon then left to go their separate ways, leaving our knight and his companions, and finally the remaining group reached their own village. The villagers were amazed at the spectacle, and at news of Don Quixote's arrival, Sancho Panza's wife ran up to her husband.
"What profit have you got from all this, your squireships?" she asked. "I have brought back no property, wife, but other things of greater value and importance."
He explained the promise of the governorship, and described his travels and adventures. Meanwhile, Don Quixote was laid out on his own bed, not yet understanding where he was. There he fell asleep. The priest and barber avoided visiting Don Quixote for a full month, in case they revived memories of his recent adventures, and plunged our knight back into his madness. However, after this time had elapsed, the ladies of the house assured the two that Don Quixote was now recovering, and so they paid him a visit. While in conversation, the priest gave news that there were Turkish threats to Christian lands. This, unfortunately, immediately reminded Don Quixote of knights errant, who would meet such a challenge without question. Their discussion was interrupted by Sancho Panza, eager to see his master and friend. On his arrival, the priest and barber took their leave, despairing of a cure for Don Quixote. Sancho discussed a number of matters of little consequence, but finally said,
"Last night the bachelor Carrasco returned from his studies in Salamanca, and let me know that a history of your worship was already in print."
Don Quixote impatiently asked the squire to fetch the bachelor, so that every detail could be explained. Carrasco arrived, and told the knight of the success of the book, and the more important episodes it contained. He explained that there were corrections needed, and that the author had promised a sequel. This promise, and the neighing of Rocinante outside, convinced our knight that he was being called upon to revive his adventures. He asked Carrasco if he might compose some verses for him, for inclusion in the sequel, but cautioned him to keep these intentions secret. Sancho returned home in high spirits to prepare for the expedition. He told his wife, Teresa, all that had taken place, and that he would soon be leaving once more. She insisted that this time he should be rewarded for his pains. On returning to our knight, Sancho brought up the subject of payment.
"My good Lady Teresa told me that I must keep a firm hand on you. The point I'm trying to make is that, as you know and told me, we are here today and gone tomorrow. Death is always in a hurry. The point is, your worship, you must fix a payment which you will give me every month I serve. This wage should be paid from your estate, since I don't like depending on favours. When, or if indeed I'm given the island you promised me, I'm not so ungrateful that I shan't allow the rent to be taken out of my wages."
Don Quixote was perplexed. "I do not recall in the histories of knights errant the award of a monthly payment or yearly stipend to a squire. Rather, they served as a courtesy, being rewarded with an island or something like that if their masters were fortunate. I am not one to change the old customs of the knights errant. Remember, good hopes are better than poor possessions, and a good claim is better than poor pay." Sancho was disappointed at this speech.
"I'm not without gratitude for what you've done. It's clear to me that in the long run your actions will be to my benefit. It's only that my wife insists on a payment. So, in conclusion, I suggest you add a codicil to your will in my favour, and then let us be off."
At that moment Carrasco, the niece and the housekeeper, entered the room. The latter was intent on preventing any further expedition. As luck would have it, Carrasco was the first to speak, and finding Sancho such an agreeable fellow, encouraged our knight. He even volunteered to fit out Don Quixote with a new helmet, albeit second-hand. The housekeeper was very upset at this behaviour, yet there was nothing she could do now to prevent the expedition. 3 days later, all was ready. Carrasco embraced the knight and begged to be kept informed of their progress. Soon the knight and squire were en route. "Friend Sancho," said Don Quixote, "we make for Toboso, where we will receive the farewell blessing of the peerless Dulcinea."
"I believe you," answered Sancho, "but there may yet be some difficulties. It will be hard to see her alone. She may have to give you her blessing over her courtyard wall."
"I don't know why you mention a courtyard wall. You must be mistaken. They only have galleries or corridors or porticos or whatever they are called in such rich royal palaces."
"That may be so, but they always seemed like walls to me."
"Oh, perhaps. As long as I see her, any ray of sun which reached my eyes from her beauty will illuminate my understanding and fortify my heart."
"Really, master?" replied Sancho. "When I saw this sun, the Lady Dulcinea, it wasn't bright enough to cast any rays. It must have been because her grace was fanning wheat at the time, and the dust she stirred up must have gathered like a cloud around her face."
Some time later, Sancho questioned Don Quixote.
"Tell me now, which is the greater thing, to raise a dead man or to kill a giant?"
"The answer is obvious," replied Don Quixote. "It is greater to bring a dead man back to life."
"I've caught you now," said Sancho. "So the fame of those who bring the dead to life, give sight to the blind, cure the lame, and restore the sick to health, before whose tombs the lamps burn, and whose chapels are full of devout people kneeling and adoring the relics, will deserve greater fame than the fame of all the heathen emperors and knights errant in the world."
"I grant you that," replied Don Quixote.
"Well, in that case, we should become saints. It is better then to be a humble friar than a knight errant?"
"That is so, but we can't all be friars. Remember, there are sainted knights in heaven."
"Yes," replied Sancho, "but I have heard that there are more friars than knights there."
The two continued their pointless argument until nightfall. It was late when they approached the town of Toboso, and all was quiet. "First, let us find the castle in which she lives," said the knight. Why, that huge dark pile over there must be the Lady Dulcinea's palace. Sancho explained that as far as he remembered, his master was mistaken, and that the lady actually lived in a small house down a blind alley. "Sancho, you idiot!" cried Don Quixote. "Since when have you found royal castles and palaces built in blind alleys?" Don Quixote ignored Sancho's suggestion and made his way towards the edifice, but finding that it was a church, was disappointed.
"Ah, well, we can't hope to find Our Lady's palace in the middle of the night. After all, I've only seen it once. I think since the rising sun will shortly make this town unpleasantly hot, we should take shelter in a nearby wood and return later to search the whole town for this palace," responded Sancho. Don Quixote agreed, and they retired to an olive grove near the city. After daybreak, he dispatched Sancho to seek out and speak to his lady, requesting her blessing for the night. "I will go, and return shortly," said Sancho, and set off on Dapple, his ass. Before long he stopped, and considered how to find the imaginary Dulcinea. At last he decided, "It will not be very difficult to convince him that the first country wench I come across is the Lady Dulcinea. Once this is done, perhaps he'll tire of sending me on such foolish errands." His mind made up, he looked around and saw 3 country girls on the road, making their way towards him. He hurried back to Don Quixote. "I bring good news," he announced. "Mount Rocinante and ride with me to the plain, for the Lady Dulcinea and 2 damsels are coming that way. Her maidens and she are dressed in gold with strings of pearls, diamonds, and rubies. What is more, they are riding on the finest horses to be seen." They set off, and dismounting close to the 3 girls, knelt before them. On looking at them, Don Quixote was puzzled. "I see only 3 country girls." The first of the girls demanded, "Get out of the way, we're in a hurry." "Oh, lady, is not your magnanimous heart melting at the sight of your knight before you?" said Sancho. "What is this?" demanded another of the girls. "Go back to your business and leave us alone." "Rise, Sancho," commanded Don Quixote. "I now see that fortune has barred the way. Cataracts have been placed over my eyes in order that that summit of human perfection, that peerless beauty, Lady Dulcinea, is changed into a rustic. Not only that, but Providence has deprived her of that characteristic of all great ladies, the sweet smell they have." "Oh, spiteful enchanters!" cried Sancho. "But to tell you the truth, master, I never saw her ugliness, only her beauty." Sancho was delighted with the success of his plan. The 2 remounted and followed the road to Saragossa, intending to be present at the city's annual festival. Before long, they encountered a cart filled with strolling players, including one wearing a mask of death. The troop alarmed both Rocinante and Dapple, and Don Quixote fell off. While Sancho attended to his master, the player wearing the mask of death mounted Dapple, and rode off waving a stick with bladders tied to it in the air. The ass stumbled in a hole and threw the rider off. Sancho ran to recover his property. Meanwhile the troop had armed themselves with stones, and seeing this, Don Quixote thought it better to retire. Turning his horse Rocinante around, he rode off, accompanied by Sancho. That night, while resting in a wood, the pair heard the rustle of the armor of a knight, who stretched himself out below a nearby tree. Once settled, the knight began to sing in praise of his mistress. Don Quixote and Sancho approached and introduced themselves to the Knight of the Wood, as they called him, and his squire. Squires and knights soon separated,
the latter to talk about their loves, while the former gave accounts of their lives. The wood knight squire, though disfigured by an enormous nose, was a kindly fellow, being particularly generous with his food and drink, until both squires fell asleep replete. The Knight of the Wood told of the perils that he had faced in order to be worthy of his love, Cassileia de Vandalia, and claimed to have fought and vanquished the great Don Quixote. Our knight was much put out by this claim, and only at the end of the tale did he reveal his identity. The two knights decided to set the record straight and joust at daybreak. They went to wake their squires to make the preparations. The squire of the Knight of the Wood commented, "'Tis not the custom in Andalusia for the squires to stand idle where their masters joust. We squires must fight too, and make splinters of one another." Sancho protested that he had no weapon, so the other suggested that they fight with linen bags filled with pebbles. At daylight, Don Quixote and Sancho were both struck by the extraordinary long nose of the other knight, who now proclaimed himself to be the Knight of the Mirrors. Don Quixote and Sancho also noticed that the same was true of his squire's proboscis. They were so surprised at the noses, they thought they had discovered a new species. The two knights moved into position while Sancho climbed a cork tree to obtain the best view of the impending battle. The Knight of the Mirrors had not yet fixed his lance or settled on his horse before Don Quixote began the battle. The first blow from our knight's lance threw the Knight of the Mirrors to the ground, where he lay as if dead, but without his terrible nose. Our knight and Sancho inspected the damage. "Believe it or not, this knight looks like the bachelor Carrasco," cried Don Quixote. Sancho replied, "My advice is that you should thrust your sword down his throat. In that way you will destroy one of the enchanters who are your enemies." As Don Quixote was about to do this, the squire to the Knight of the Mirrors ran up, crying, "Don Quixote, he really is the bachelor Carrasco, and I am Celio, Sancho's neighbour. The noses were only painted pasteboard." Don Quixote was not entirely convinced, and demanded that the knight, who had now recovered, retract all his claims. Once this was done, the knight and squire were allowed to depart and have their injuries seen to. It later came out that this plan was hatched by the priest and barber in order to bring our knight home. It was decided that Carrasco should play a knight and Celio his squire. In disguise they would catch up with Don Quixote. The bachelor, as knight, would then challenge and overcome Don Quixote in a joust. Once he had succeeded, Carrasco would demand that Don Quixote return to his village and not venture out again for at least 2 years. In this way everyone expected our knight to be cured of his madness. However, as Celio remarked, "It is easy to plan a thing, but very often very difficult to see it through." Don Quixote continued his journey in a happy frame of mind. He considered himself the most valiant knight alive as a result of his victory. The two were joined by a travelling gentleman. On the journey, Sancho went off to fetch some curds. Meanwhile, our knight noticed a cart with royal banners flying on it moving towards him. "Sancho, quick! Bring me my helmet!" Sancho, having just returned, and being startled at this request, didn't know what to do with the curds. He dropped them in the helmet, which he handed to his master. Don Quixote was furious at his stupidity, and berated him for being so stupid a squire. Don Quixote anchored himself before the cart, which was attended by the driver, and a man on a mule. "Where are you going? What carriage is this? What does it contain, and what are those banners?" he demanded. The driver replied,
"We are going to court, to present a lion to His Majesty, and the flags show that this cart belongs to our Duke."
Don Quixote questioned the man further, and then demanded that the lion be released. Sancho and the gentleman tried to dissuade him, but without success. At the point of the knight's lance, the cage was opened. At this, everyone else departed to a safe distance with their mounts. Thinking the matter over, Don Quixote decided to challenge the lion on foot, as Rocinante might be terrified by the beast. However, the lion in the cage only looked around and then settled down again. Our knight suggested that the keeper hit the lion to force him out.
"I can't do that. I shall be the first to be torn to pieces. You've already shown your courage, and there's no disgrace in not having forced the beast out."
"That's true," Don Quixote agreed. "Shut the door, and give me a certificate confirming my challenge to the lion as proof." He then took the linen cloth he had just used to wipe the curds from his face and stuck it on the end of his lance, giving the all-clear to the others. Sancho was told what had happened. Don Quixote explained that it was another example of enchantment, and asked the keeper to let the king know about the incident should he ask. After this adventure, the gentleman, who was called Don Diego, invited the pair to stay with him, which they did for a number of days. On leaving the gentleman's house, the knight and squire met up with two scholars, and having been introduced, they were invited to what promised to be a magnificent wedding between Camacho the rich and Quiteria the fair. On reaching the outskirts of the town, where the marriage was to take place, the knight and his squire chose to stay out in the open for the night, it being more suitable to their profession. The following morning they were awoken by the smell of cooking, and on investigation discovered a huge feast being prepared in a nearby field. Sancho was delighted. One of the cooks told him that the food was being provided free by Camacho the rich for his wedding, and that the squire could help himself. Before long a large crowd had gathered in the field, eventually to be followed by the bride and groom. Suddenly a loud noise was heard, and a man ran up shouting, "Hold everything, rash and thoughtless people!" Turning to the bride, he said, "Quiteria, you are promised to another. You cannot marry Camacho. It is unlawful unless I, poor Basilio, die." With that he drew a rapier and threw himself upon it. A crowd collected around the badly wounded man. In a faint voice, Basilio whispered, "Quiteria, will you not consent to marry me in my last moments?" Don Quixote announced to the crowd that the request seemed eminently reasonable, and, at last, Quiteria consented. But no sooner had they received the blessing from the priest who was in attendance than Basilio sprang to his feet and withdrew the rapier. On inspection it was seen that the rapier had passed into a hollow tube concealed in Basilio's clothing, and he was untouched. The bridegroom, Camacho, and his friends drew their swords. It was only the intervention of the priest that prevented any bloodshed. Camacho realized that Quiteria was indeed in love with Basilio, and relented. He then invited the crowd to enjoy the food and entertainment, as though he had been married as planned. Later that day, Don Quixote, Sancho, and one of the scholars left with a newly married couple and stayed with them for 3 days. Just before leaving, Don Quixote asked one of the scholars to find a guide to the cave of Montesinos. He had heard that it was full of wonders, and wanted to explore it for himself. Don Quixote, Sancho, and the scholar set out for the cave. On reaching a small village, they bought a quantity of rope, so that Don Quixote could descend into the cave, which they reached early the following afternoon. The rope was tied around Don Quixote's waist. Sancho told him to be careful.
"Consider what you are doing. Don't bury yourself alive. It's really not necessary for you to explore this place.
Tie me securely and be quiet. We have been careless in not having brought a little bell, which can be tied to the rope, for when you heard it, you would know that I was still alive and still descending. But it's too late now. Such an enterprise as this, dear Sancho, was reserved for me alone."
And kneeling near the entrance to the cave, he prayed quietly to himself for a few minutes. Suddenly he cried out,
"Oh, peerless mistress Dulcinea, grant me your protection in this fearful abyss into which I descend, to show that there is nothing I will not attempt to overcome."
Our brave knight then approached the chasm. Seeing that it was not possible to be let down until he had cut away the brambles and undergrowth, he drew his sword and began to cut the briars. At the noise of doing this, a huge number of jackdaws, crows, and bats flew out of the cave. At last Don Quixote stood up, and seeing no more crows, birds, or bats, was let down. As he descended, Don Quixote called out for more and more rope until they had used almost all of it. Half an hour later, he reappeared.
"Welcome back, your worship. We were thinking you had stayed down there to begin a family,"
called Sancho. Don Quixote ignored this remark. When they had eventually pulled him back up all the way, they saw he had passed out. They untied him, turned him over and over, and shook him hard. After a while, he came to his senses. Then, looking about him, he said,
"God pardon you, friends, for you have interrupted the most delightful dream any man could have."
The scholar and Sancho listened, and begged him to tell them what he had seen in that hell.
"Hell? I wouldn't call it that. It does not deserve the name, as you will see."
Don Quixote felt hungry, and asked for something to eat. Once he had eaten, he commanded,
"Let no one get up. Listen to me, all of you."
He described what he had seen.
"I descended to a ledge some way down, knowing that I would need more rope if I was to reach the bottom of the pit. I called out for more, but you did not seem to hear me. I realized that you had probably used up all the rope. So, gathering what rope you had let me down on, I sat on it and wondered how I could reach the bottom without anything to support me. While thinking, a deep sleep came over me. I suddenly woke up on a lawn over which a venerable old man was approaching me from the castle ahead, which was composed of bright and transparent crystal. He spoke. 'I am warden and perpetual guardian of this place. I am Montesinos. For many centuries, courageous knight, we who dwell in these enchanted places have been waiting to see you, so that you may let the world know what is contained here, buried in this deep cave which is called Montesinos' cave. Come with me.' On entering the palace, I was shown a knight laid out on a sheet of marble. 'This is my friend Durandarte, the best of all knights errant. He remains here enchanted by Merlin the wizard, said to be the devil's son. How he enchanted us no one knows, but one day it will be explained. What amazes me is that I know that Durandarte ended his life in my arms, and after his death I cut out his heart with my own hands to take to the lady Belerma, as he had instructed. And yet, how is it that he now complains and sighs as though he were alive?' At this point the wretched Durandati cried out. Montesinos threw himself on his knees before the corpse. "Long ago, dearest cousin, I did what you instructed on that bitter day of our defeat. I set out on the road to France, taking care that the heart I took should be delivered safely to the Lady Belerma. The same Belerma whom Merlin has kept here for many years, enchanted like you, and I, your squire, and many other of your friends. Yet though 500 years have passed, none of us are dead. I have news that will perhaps help. Here is the great knight, Don Quixote de la Mancha, who has revived and improved the ancient art of chivalry. Through his mediation and help, we may yet be disenchanted." At this moment screams and cries were heard. I turned my head, and through crystal walls observed a procession of lovely maidens, the last holding in our hands a white cloth on which, as far as I could see, lay a mummified heart. Montesinos told me that these were the enchanted servants of Durandati, and the lady with the cloth, the Lady Belerma. At this point Montesinos added that if it had not been for her grief, the Lady Belerma would compare favourably, if not exceed, the beauty of the great Dulcinea del Toboso.
"I'm amazed," interrupted Sancho. "You mean you didn't spring on the old dodderer, kick his bones to pulp, and pull his beard out for saying that?"
"No, Sancho, it would not have been right. We are all obliged to respect the old." The scholar asked the knight, "How was it possible, having so short a time below, that you heard and said so much?"
"It was no more than an hour,"
Sancho added. "This cannot be true. 3 full days and nights seem to have passed," replied Don Quixote, and then proceeded with his story, telling how he saw, amongst others, his Dulcinea enchanted.
"How did you recognize her among the enchanted?"
asked Sancho. "I recognized her," answered Don Quixote, "because she had on the same clothes as she was wearing when you pointed her out to me. I spoke to her, but she gave no answer. In fact, she turned her back and ran away. One of the luckless Dulcinea's companions drew near me and said, 'My lady Dulcinea implores you to let her know how you are, as she is in great need. She also desires that you be so kind as to lend her 6 guineas. She promises that she will pay you back.' I was taken aback at this, and questioned Montesinos about this request. He told me that indeed the enchanted could also be in need of money. So I turned back to her companion and said, 'Friend, tell your mistress that I am grieved by her troubles, and wish to relieve them. She will hear that I have made an oath, and vow not to rest and to travel the 7 continents, until I have released her from her enchantment.' At this the lady leapt away. Sancho, knowing himself to be the real enchanter of Dulcinea, was ready to laugh at this tale, which seemed a complete fabrication. However, at this moment a man on a loaded mule approached them. He did not have time to stop, but suggested that the group join him and lodge at the inn that night, if they wished to hear of wonders. The 4 set off, and the man began his tale.
"A certain alderman from my village, which is near here, was cheated of his ass, and every inquiry after the beast proved fruitless. One day, however, when in the market-place, Another alderman said that he had heard that the ass had recently been seen in the mountains. The two then set off to recover it, and decided that to attract the beast they would imitate its call. So once in the mountains, each went off and called without result, other than being attracted by the call of the other. They then changed their plan, deciding to bray in unison at a given signal, again without result, until they came across the body of the missing ass. The story of this strange search ran around the nearby villages, and now my fellow villagers are constantly mocked by outsiders braying. We can no longer stand this ridicule, so I am now taking back arms so we can fight with our persecutors."
This story was interrupted by the arrival of a puppeteer, known as Pedro the Puppet Master. In a loud voice, he asked, "Landlord, have you a room? I have brought the fortune-telling ape and the puppet show, the releasing of Melisendra."
"Your worship is very welcome," said the innkeeper. "I would turn out the Duke of Alba himself to make room for Pedro the Puppet Master. Bring your ape and puppets, for there are people here who will pay to see the show and the ape's talents."
Don Quixote asked the landlord who this Master Pedro was, and about the show and ape he brought with him.
"He's a famous puppeteer. He has a travelling show about the releasing of Melisendra by the renowned Don Quixote. He also has an ape, which, if you ask him anything, listens, and then jumps on his master's shoulder and tells him the answer, which Pedro repeats."
When the puppeteer returned, our knight was the first to speak.
"Senor, what will be our fortune?" "My ape," replied Master Pedro, "gives no reply about the future, but knows something of the past and a little of the present."
The company then listened in surprise to an accurate account of their present circumstances. At its end, Pedro announced,
"And now, in view of the distinguished company present, I intend to put my puppet show in order and entertain you for free."
Don Quixote was not entirely satisfied, so he took Sancho into a corner of the stable where they could be alone, and said,
"Listen, Sancho, I've thought about that ape's talents. There seems to be no doubt that this Pedro must have a pact with the devil. You see, the devil knows the past and present, but only guesses at the future. To know the future is for God alone."
"All the same," replied Sancho, "I wish you'd ask Master Pedro's ape about whether what happened in the cave of Montesinos was true. In my opinion, it was all fiction, or you dreamed it."
"I'll do that, though I do have reservations about it,"
said Don Quixote. At that moment, Master Pedro came to fetch the pair, since the show was ready to begin. Don Quixote asked him his question, and Pedro went off to fetch his ape.
"Listen," he commanded. "This gentleman wants to know if certain things which happened in Montesinos' cave were true or false."
The ape leapt up and apparently spoke in his ear. Pedro immediately answered,
"The ape says that part is false and part is true. If you want to know more, you'll have to wait until next Friday, since the ape has exhausted his powers for the time being."
Soon all was settled, and the show began. The narrator began telling how the peerless Melisendra was held captive in the castle of Saragossa. Don Quixote, her husband, arrives in the town disguised as an ordinary traveller. Melisendra lets herself down to his horse from her prison, but watchers close by see what has happened and inform the Moorish king. He orders the alarm to be raised. At this, a numerous cavalcade rides out in pursuit of the pair of Christian lovers. Afraid they will catch them and bring them back tied to their own horse's tail, Don Quixote rose to his feet, thinking it only right to help the fugitives. "Never while I live shall I permit an outrage to be done in my presence on so famous a knight and so bold a lover as Don Quixote." At the arrival of so many puppet Moors on the stage, Don Quixote drew his sword and struck out, beheading some, laming others, and finally hacking to pieces all the tackling and figures, ignoring the puppet master's protests. "In heaven's name, let me die! Now I am destitute and wretched," lamented Pedro. Sancho was moved to say, "I assure you my master would not allow any man to lose out because of him." In his defense, Don Quixote explained that the puppets had seemed real to him. "So, although it wasn't a malicious act on my part, I'll bear the full cost." He then generously settled the account and paid the bill for supper for everyone. Three days later, Don Quixote and his squire reached the banks of the river Ebro. They noticed a small vessel moored there. Leaving horse and ass on the bank, the two climbed aboard the boat, slipped the painter, and floated downstream. After a while, several corn mills appeared. "Behold, Sancho, you see the castle, city, or fortress ahead? There lies a damsel imprisoned. I am brought here to release her."
"What are you talking about? Those are corn mills," replied Sancho.
"Peace! Though they seem to be mills, they have been transformed by enchanters." At this moment, the labourers in the mills called out at the pair, warning them of the dangerous current. "Scoundrels!" cried Don Quixote. "Set free your captive!" He drew his sword and waved it in the air towards the millers. Sancho cowered in the vessel and prayed for deliverance. Deliverance was swift in arriving. The millers, using poles, reached and upset the boat, casting the knight and Sancho into the water. The two were rescued and dragged ashore. The fisherman, whose boat they had taken, came up, furious at his loss. Don Quixote, without the least concern, offered to pay for the damage, on condition that the millers give up their captive held in the castle.
"What captive? What prison do you mean?"
asked one. "Let it rest," replied Don Quixote, and turning towards the mills, he called out, "Friends in prison, pardon me. It is ordained that your release is reserved for some more fortunate knight." In the meantime, Sancho had settled the bill for the loss of the boat. The following evening, the two came across a duke and duchess with their court, out hunting. Sancho was instructed to make the introductions and to find out more about the strangers. The duchess, having heard of the story of Don Quixote, decided to enjoy herself at the knight's expense. The pair were made welcome. "I say, Sir Knight of the Lions, come to a castle of mine which is close at hand, where you will be received in a manner suitable for a person of your rank," said the duchess. On entering the courtyard, a large cloak of finest scarlet was thrown over Don Quixote's shoulder, and all the household cried, "Welcome, the cream and flower of knights errant!" The party then entered the castle, and here, in stately splendour, the two guests were entertained. Among those who had joined the dinner was a cleric, who took exception to the duke's encouragement of our knight's fancies. Don Quixote defended his position. My intentions are always directed towards virtuous ends. Whether anyone who acts like this deserves to be called a fool, I leave to your highness to judge."
"Well said," responded Sancho.
"I suppose you are the Sancho Panza to whom your master promised an island?" inquired the Duke.
"I am," confessed Sancho. "As long as my master lives, and I follow, we shall not lack kingdoms to rule or islands to govern."
"That you shall not," replied the Duke. "For in the name of Don Quixote, I promise you the government of an island of mine, which is presently vacant. Kneel, Sancho," commanded Don Quixote, "and kiss his Excellency's feet for the favor he has done." Sancho did so. At this point the cleric, in a furious temper, left the room, much to the amusement of the rest of the company. Over the next few days our knight and his squire were feted, entertained, and presented with gifts of armor and rich clothing by the Duke and Duchess. Meanwhile their highnesses devised a trick to play on their two guests. One summer evening, while camping in the wood on the estate, the company were alarmed by the sound of trumpets and other musical instruments. Shortly afterwards a boy, dressed as a fiend, passed by. On being questioned by the Duke, he announced,
"I am the devil, after Don Quixote de la Mancha. The others are 6 troops of enchanters, taking the lady Dulcinea del Toboso and the old man Montesinos to tell the knight how she is to be released from her enchantment."
This courier rode off, and soon terrible noises came from all parts of the wood. A wagon then appeared, filled with figures dressed as sages and knights of past ages. Their arrival was accompanied by the sound of sweet music, and there followed a triumphal cart which stopped before the company. On the cart was a throne, on which sat a beautiful veiled nymph, and close to her sat a robed figure in a black veil. This veil was drawn back to reveal the hideous countenance of Death, an impersonation of the wizard Merlin. This Merlin spoke, and commanded that Sancho should endure 3,000 lashes to release the lady Dulcinea from her enchantment. Sancho refused, even when the lady with the veil said that this was necessary. "I am sure," said the Duke, "that if you do not relent and become softer than a ripe fig as a result of the lashes, you will have no government of mine." Sancho then agreed, provided that he could take his time over the lashes and do the penance wherever he might please. These conditions were agreed by Merlin. "When the number of lashes required is completed, then at that instant you will see the lady Dulcinea disenchanted and full of gratitude for Sancho." Don Quixote was delighted by this, and kissed his squire. The cart then moved off, and the party returned to the castle. Sancho spent the following morning writing a letter to his wife, telling her of his recent adventures and the mixed blessing of the previous evening's events. He passed the letter to his master to be approved, who passed it to the Duchess and finally the Duke. The Duchess took the letter to the garden, where the Duke read it, and gave his approval to the adventures as they were described. While in the garden, the crowd suddenly heard the beat of a drum, and saw a procession of 3 young men dressed in black, one of whom was playing a flute. Behind walked a gigantic man, again in black. He knelt before the Duke and announced, "My name is Trifaldian, squire to the Countess Trifaldi. Could you give permission for the lady to approach to relate the story of her misfortune? She has travelled far in order to speak with the invincible knight Don Quixote, who is presently a guest here."
The Duke replied, "We have heard of the Countess Trifaldi and her misfortune. She is otherwise known as the afflicted Countess. Please, bring her here to speak to Don Quixote." Trifaldian and the procession departed, returning before long, accompanied by the Countess and 12 duennas, who each wore a veil. The Countess, without lifting her veil, knelt before the Duke.
"I am about to tell a story of much unhappiness, but before I can begin, could you let me know if that renowned knight, Don Quixote, and his squire, Sancho Panza, are here?"
"The same," responded Sancho, "and beside me, Don Quixote. Please tell your story."
At this, Don Quixote stood up and spoke to the Countess.
"If I can help you in any way in your misfortune, I am at your service."
The Countess began her tale. The court of the famous kingdom of Cadiah was blessed by an only child to the king and queen, the Infanta Antonomasia. She was brought up under my care, since I am the most senior of the duennas. At 14, she was the most beautiful creature alive. Among her suitors was a knight of the court named Don Clavio, a musician, poet, and fine dancer, who also made bird cages in a very professional manner. In spite of these talents, he would have found it impossible to approach the Infanta had it not been for the fact that he bewitched me. He showered me with gifts, but what was the real causes of my downfall was his singing of verses. In this way, I agreed to become the go-between, and this knight was to become the unlikely husband of the Infanta. By persuading the Infanta to confirm the engagement in writing, I soon saw to it that the pair were married. No sooner was this done, however, than there arrived on the scene the giant Mambrino on a wooden horse. He had come to punish the couple for their hasty and devious match. He instantly transformed the Infanta into a brass monkey and her husband into a metal crocodile. He then declared, these two presumptuous lovers would only be returned to normal form when the valiant Don Quixote de la Mancha has fought me. Turning to me as the cause of all the trouble, he was about to cut off my head. I begged for mercy, and was given it. But he cast a spell on myself and all the duennas of the palace. At this point the lady and the duennas lifted their veils to reveal beards which covered their faces. The assembled company were astonished at the spectacle before them.
"I swear I never heard such an adventure. The devil take you, Mambrino! Could you not think of any other punishment than putting beards on them?"
exclaimed Sancho.
"I'll tear my own beard off if I cannot release you from your punishment. I am ready to serve you," promised Don Quixote.
The Countess spoke again. Presently Mambrino is about 5,000 leagues away. However, the giant told me of a wooden horse, which is able, through the magic of Merlin, to fly through the air, guided by a peg fixed in its head. He said that the horse would appear close by me, once I had found the famous knight Don Quixote.
"Oh, I'll look forward to seeing this beast," said Sancho, "though I'm not so keen on going with my master."
"Honest Sancho," noted the Countess. "I believe your assistance will be absolutely necessary. Do you really want to see those ladies remain as they are for the rest of their lives?"
"Sancho will do his duty and come with me," said our knight.
"Brave knight, may luck, strength, and courage be with you." A last point I was informed of was that the riders of the wooden horse must be blindfolded before they travel, instructed the Countess. By that evening The wooden horse had been discovered and brought forward. The Countess urged the knight to mount.
"Madam, I will do so with all my heart. My only wish is to see your ladyship and your friends shaven and clean."
"Friend Sancho," promised the Duke,
"be assured that on your return, be it on horse or on foot, your island will await you. The islanders will welcome their governor, but only on the condition that you accompany your master on this adventure."
The two then mounted the horse and were blindfolded. The company gathered around and wished them well, calling out,
"Watch how high you fly! Be careful of falling!"
Sancho wondered how they managed to be so high when these voices seemed so close. Then he shouted,
"I feel the wind upon me now. Doubtless we are high in the air, where the snow and hail are formed. If we go any higher, we will reach the sun, where we will be burnt alive."
At this moment, some lighted flax on a long cane was applied to the tail of the horse. Since the wooden horse was filled with fireworks and gunpowder, it instantly blew up, hurling the riders to the ground. Don Quixote and Sancho got up and, taking off their blindfolds, were amazed to see themselves in the same garden as before, with a crowd of people all laid out around them, pretending to be unconscious. Ahead of them was a lance, pinning a sheet of paper to a tree, on which was written the following: "The renowned knight Don Quixote has, by his courageous attempt to assist the Countess, satisfied Mambrino. The beards have vanished, and Don Clavio and Antomasia have been restored to their usual appearance. Once the necessary penance is completed, the white dove will be in the arms of her beloved mate." Don Quixote believed the latter to be a reference to the disenchantment of the lady Dulcinea. The crowd about them then pretended to recover, and on reading the scroll, congratulated the pair. Sancho elaborated on the journey.
"As we were passing through the region of the fire near the sun, I could not resist a peep around me. I saw the whole earth and all the men on it. I also saw the constellation of Pleidia, named after the she-goats of this country, and played with them for 3/4 of an hour."
Sancho was accused of either lying or dreaming. Questioned more closely about the goats by the Duke, he described them.
2 of them are green, 2 carnation, 2 blue, and 1 motley-coloured. They're different because of the difference between heaven and earth."
The Duke and Duchess were very amused by the outcome of their trick. The time soon came when the Duke had arranged for Sancho to take up his governorship. Before he left, Don Quixote sat down with Sancho alone in a room, and instructed him as to the best form of government in his opinion. Before long all was arranged, and Sancho departed. This left our knight in a melancholy mood. On seeing this, the Duchess arranged for 4 of her maids to serve him. After supper, he was getting ready for bed, and while undressing, he holed one of his socks. He was upset by this, but cheered up when he found some riding boots that Sancho had left for him. On going to bed, he found he could not sleep, owing to his mood and the warmth of the night. On going to the window, he overheard the following conversation. "Dear Altisidora, I am sure everyone is asleep, except he whom you love. Go to his window and sing quietly to him, accompanied by your harp." Soon Don Quixote heard sweet harp music and singing outside his window. Our knight sighed and said to himself,
"Why is the peerless Dulcinea so unlucky as not to have others fall in love with her in the same way that so many ladies fall in love with me?"
At this, he threw himself back onto his bed. Much later, he arose and dressed. He came across Altisidora and her friend in the gallery. Altisidora swooned at his appearance. Her friend suggested that Don Quixote might try to help her.
"Madam, be so kind as to leave a lute in my room tonight, and I shall, as far as possible, try to help this poor damsel."
He then left the room. Altisidora recovered immediately, and told the Duchess of her jest. That night Don Quixote took up the lute and began to sing at the open window of his bedroom. Almost everyone in the castle could hear him. Suddenly, from the window above, a rope was dropped down. On it were 100 tinkling bells. Following this, 100 cats, also with bells on their collars, were lowered to the window. Don Quixote panicked at this sight. It seemed that a legion of little devils had broken in. The cats knocked over the lamps and ran madly about the room. Taking hold of his sword, Don Quixote chased all but one of them back through the window. This one, being cornered, sprang at the knight's face and scratched him severely. Don Quixote roared, bringing in the Duke and Duchess. On removing the cat, our knight's face was attended to, and his noble friends were now somewhat concerned that their prank would keep Don Quixote in bed for days. Meanwhile, Sancho had arrived in an unknown town. His attendants led him to believe that the place was the island of Barataria. His arrival was greeted by many of the townsfolk and by the ringing of bells. He was taken to the principal church, where he was given the keys to the town. Next, he was taken to the courts and seated on the judge's throne. The Duke's steward addressed him.
"It is the ancient custom that everyone who takes possession of the island needs to answer a question, which must be both difficult and complicated. By the answer given, the town is given the idea of the governor's understanding, and the townspeople are accordingly happy or sad."
While the steward was talking, Sancho looked at a number of large letters on the opposite wall. Since he could not read, he asked what was written there. The answer came,
"Sir, that is a record of the day that your lordship took possession of the island. The inscription reads, 'On this day, date such and such, there took possession of the island one Don Sancho Panza. May he enjoy it for many years.'" "Who are you calling Don Sancho Panza?" "Yourself. There's no other Panza known here." "Then take note," said Sancho, "that I am no Don. There's never been a Don in my family. Plain Sancho is my name."
At this moment 2 men entered the room. One was dressed as a labourer, the other as a tailor, who carried a pair of scissors in one hand. The latter spoke.
"My Lord Governor, this fellow here came to my shop yesterday. He gave me a piece of cloth and asked, 'Is there enough here to make a cap?' I answered yes. He asked if there was enough for 2. I measured it and said again yes. He kept doing this until we reached 5. He ordered these 5. He's just come to collect them and refuses to pay."
"Is this true?"
asked Sancho, turning to the labourer.
"Yes, sir," answered the fellow, "but make him show you the 5 caps he made for me."
"With pleasure,"
replied the tailor. He then displayed 5 caps,
one on the end of each finger of one of his hands. He said,
"Here are the 5 caps."
Everyone laughed. Sancho thought for a while and then said, "Without any further ado, I have decided that the tailor will lose his fee and the labourer his cloth. The caps will be given to the prisoners in the jail."
Again the assembly laughed, but the judgment was carried out. Sancho was then taken from the courts to the palace. Sancho sat down for dinner, accompanied by a man holding a whalebone. Soon a plate of fruit was set before him. No sooner had he tasted it than it was snatched away. The same happened with the meat. "My lord," warned the man behind him, "your food must be watched. I am a doctor, and it is to preserve your good health, since you are governor, that we do this." Sancho pointed to all the dishes on the table in turn, and the doctor made some objection to his eating any of them. Sancho took exception to this.
"Senior Doctor, get out of my sight this instant, before I beat you and all your family with a cudgel."
He was interrupted in his speech by a messenger bearing a letter. It proved to be a letter from the Duke, warning Sancho that an attack upon the island was expected imminently, and that there were spies already there. A page now entered, announcing,
"A farmer is here who wishes to speak on urgent business."
Sancho concluded that, as governor, he must be considered to be made of marble, since there seemed to be no opportunity to eat or rest, and no time to himself. On entering, the farmer informed Sancho that one of his sons, who was studying law, had fallen in love with one of the girls in the town. What he needed from Sancho was a letter of recommendation to her father, approving the match, since both families were equally matched in wealth. However, there was one snag. The son had always been subject to fits, and on one occasion happened to have fallen into a fire and badly burnt his face, but he hoped that this would not prevent Sancho from giving his permission.
"Do you require anything else?" asked Sancho.
"There is one thing," replied the farmer. "I wonder if you might give me, say, 300 or 600 crowns towards making my son's fortune, so that he can set up home after his marriage." "Is there anything else?" "Nothing I can think of at the moment." "Get out of my sight, you rascal! What do I care for you, your son, or his girl?"
The farmer left, bowing low, as he had been instructed to do. The wounded Don Quixote remained out of circulation for 6 days. One night, whilst meditating on his misfortunes, he heard a key turn in his bedroom door. The door opened. Don Quixote rose and stared at the door, expecting Altisidora to enter. Instead, he saw a figure which looked like a reverent duenna. She advanced slowly, candle in hand. "Lord, what do I see?" she exclaimed, on seeing the knight enveloped in a quilt and covered with bandages around his head. She dropped her candle and tried to find the door. "Who are you, ghost?" asked Don Quixote.
"I am no ghost, but Donna Rodriguez, maid of honor to my Duchess. I have come to tell you about a problem which only you can solve. But first I must fetch another light."
In her absence, our knight imagined the lady to have been sent by the devil, and went over to lock the door. Before he could do so, the duenna returned. Don Quixote went back to his bed. "Now, madam, tell me all," he commanded.
"You may have noticed that, though very beautiful, the lady's maid Altisidora has a severe problem with her breath. I shouldn't go on, since walls have ears, but the real problem concerns my Lady Duchess. You may have observed her beauty, but did you know she has some awful—"
At this moment the door burst open. The startled Donna Rodriguez dropped her candle. In complete darkness she felt two hands grasp her throat, while other hands slapped her. Don Quixote remained quietly on his bed until, having finished with the duenna, the invisible intruders pinched and tweaked our knight for over half an hour. Then they vanished. The duenna adjusted her clothing, leaving Don Quixote perplexed by the whole incident. Sancho, tired of being treated as a slab of marble, demanded supper late that night. The doctor relented, and at last supper came. Sancho laid into the various dishes put before him. Calling over the carver, he said, "I intend to clear this island of idlers, vagabonds, and tricksters. I suggest we make a tour of the town." After supper, the entourage set out. Sancho, with his rod of office, marched in their midst. Having settled a gambling dispute, Sancho announced that he would close down all the casinos, though with prompting from one of the officers, conceded that those for the rich could probably be allowed to remain open. Soon afterwards, 2 servants brought along a beautiful girl, dressed as a man. The governor asked who she was, and why on earth she was dressed as she was. The girl replied, "I said I was the daughter of Pedro Mazorca, who has a wool business in the town, but that is not really the truth. My real father has been keeping me confined in a chapel since my mother's death 10 years ago. I never saw the moon, the sun, or the stars, nor did I know what churches, streets, or squares were. The only man I know apart from my father are my brother and Pedro Mazorca, who does business with my father. My brother described the bullfights and other spectacles to me, and I longed to see them. After much persuasion, my brother helped me by changing clothes with me. We walked all over the town, but when we saw your group approaching, my brother ran away, thinking it was the watch. I followed, but stumbled and fell, so here I am." At that moment the brother, dressed as a girl, was brought along by a sergeant. Sancho said, "If you'd only told us what you were up to at the start, it would have been easier. As it is, we'll see the two of you home safely." The governor and the company left the two at a grand house. Sancho was feeling pleased. That young man would be a suitable match for his daughter, and in his present office no father could refuse his permission for marriage. So ended the first night's round for Sancho. The story goes that the intruders into Don Quixote's bedroom were the Duchess and Altisidora. It appears that they had followed the duenna when she collected the second light, and had spent some time listening at the door. When the duenna began to speak of the Duchess's imperfections, the two burst into the room. The Duchess was still amused by the incident the following morning, and in this elated mood decided to tell Sancho's wife, Teresa, of her husband's promotion. She wrote, "Your husband's excellent qualities have resulted in my asking my husband, the Duke, to confer on him the governorship of one of his many islands. I am told he governs well, which is a blessing, since good governors are difficult to find. With this letter I enclose a coral necklace, and I send my regards to your daughter. Tell her I mean to make a fine match for her when she least expects it. I am told there are fat acorns in your village. Please send me 2 dozen. Write a long letter to tell me how you are. If you need anything, let me know. Your loving friend, the Duchess. Teresa, Sancho's daughter Sanchia, and all the neighbors were very impressed by the news from the Duchess. The morning after his tour of inspection, Sancho was refused breakfast by the doctor, and was told that he must instead attend to the administration of justice. Following the morning session, which proved surprisingly successful, Sancho was given an excellent lunch. During the meal, a letter arrived by courier from Don Quixote. The secretary was instructed to read it aloud. From Don Quixote to Sancho Panza, governor of the island of Barataria. I expected to hear, dear Sancho, news of carelessness and blunders. Instead, I hear of your vigilance and discretion. I believe that in order to properly reflect your position, you should buy some new clothes. The Duchess has sent a messenger to your wife with your hunting suit, together with a present. I have been under the weather, owing to being clawed by some cats. But it was nothing. Let me know what's happening. I am thinking of giving up this easy life and resuming my duties as a knight, in preference to anything else. I hear there may be spies on your island sent by the Duke. I am writing this in Latin, since I have been informed that you have learned this language since your promotion. God be with you, my friend, Don Quixote. Sancho sent an immediate answer, which read, There has been much to do here, so I haven't been able to get in touch before. The Duke has informed me that there are spies on the island, and they are out to kill me. I haven't found any yet, except a doctor who was hired by the islanders to look after their governor. He prescribes fasting, thereby reducing his victim to skin and bone. In short, I'm starving here. I've heard that it is a custom to give a new governor a loan or a gift, and that this is so for all governments, so I shall be upset if you quarrel with the Duke and Duchess. I can't understand the piece about the cats, but maybe it's one of the tricks of your old enemies, the enchanters. I have no present for you for the time being. If my wife writes, pay the postage and forward the letter. Heaven protect your worship, and keep me safe and sound, which I doubt, seeing how I am treated by the doctor. Yours, Sancho Panza, Governor. Sancho sent off the letter, and spent the rest of the day making laws, some of which are still observed today as the regulations of the great governor Sancho Panza. Don Quixote's wounds had now healed, and he decided to ask the Duke and Duchess if he might leave for the tournament at Saragossa. But as he was dining with their highnesses and about to make his request, 2 women in deep mourning, sobbing and groaning, entered the hall. Don Quixote persuaded them to lift their veils. It was the duenna, Donna Rodriguez, and her daughter. She spoke to our knight. It wasn't long ago that I told you about the wicked peasant who had used this unfortunate girl here. From what I understand, you are about to leave. Before you do, would you challenge the villain and force him to wed my daughter?
Worthy madam, replied Don Quixote,
I accept the challenge, though your daughter would have been better off not to have believed the promises of her lover in the first place. I'll leave immediately, with the Duke's permission." "Don't trouble yourself to find him," said the Duke. "I'll have him brought here. Since that is the case, I promise to challenge him and resolve the matter forthwith." With that, the knight pulled off his gauntlet and threw it into the hall. The Duke accepted the challenge in the name of the peasant, and declared that the duel would take place in 6 days, the weapons being those customary amongst knights. "However, it will be necessary to have the lady's agreement to the justice of this cause," added the Duke. The 2 ladies agreed, and the Duchess invited them to stay in the castle. The jolly atmosphere of dinner that evening was heightened by the arrival of the courier, who had been sent to Sancho's wife, Teresa, bringing back letters for the Duchess and the governor. Elsewhere, a hungry governor was just falling asleep when bells and voices aroused him. Stark naked, he looked out of his bedroom door. 20 fully armed people were coming along the gallery crying, "Arm! Arm, my lord governor! Arm! Enemies are on the island!" Sancho protested that he had no experience of fighting. "What cowardice is this?" said one. "We want you to be our leader and our captain." Then the crowd thrust Sancho into armor, tying shields about him and pushing a lance into his hands. They then urged him to lead the way. In his ungainly uniform, the unfortunate governor took his first step and fell over. In this position he looked like a tortoise on his back. The jesting crowd offered him no assistance, and instead trampled over him. Around him, one of them issued orders, calling for all the instruments of death he could think of. Sancho muttered to himself, "Lord, let this island be taken, so that, dead or alive, I might be delivered." When least expecting it, he was cheered with shouts of triumph. "Victory! Victory! Rise, Senor Governor, and enjoy the triumph!" The crowd helped Sancho to his feet, untied the shields, and seated him on his bed. Having dressed, Sancho went to the stable, saddled Dapple, and mounted him in much pain. "Make way!" he cried. "Make way! Let me return to freedom. I was not born a governor. I prefer the simple life. Make way and let me go! I wish to have my ribs bandaged, which seem to be broken, thanks to those of you who trampled over me. I shall be giving the Duke an account of my administration." The crowd parted and let him through, providing him with all he needed for the journey back to the Duke. The Duke and Duchess were well aware that the peasant whom Don Quixote had challenged had fled to Flanders, unlikely ever to return. Therefore they chose a servant, Tosilos, to take his place, and told him what to do. On his way out of the town, Sancho came across a neighbor, dressed as a pilgrim, and accompanied by 5 others. He invited Sancho to dine with his companions in a popular grove and tell him of his travels. A marvelous feast with wine and caviar was laid out. Soon all but Sancho and his neighbor were fast asleep. The 2 retired to the shade of a beech tree, where they exchanged news. It was late when Sancho left, and he was unable to reach the Duke's castle that day. While looking for shelter for the night, Dapple missed his footing, and fell with his rider into a pit among some ruined houses. The pit had steep sides, and try as he might, the squire was unable to climb out without assistance. He shouted in vain, for there was no one about, and he was stuck there for the night. At daybreak he examined his prison closely, and noticed a small crevice on one side of the pit. He squeezed himself into the hole, and found that the opening grew larger as he progressed forwards. This passage led to another larger cave. Having made this discovery, he returned for his ass. Soon he had enlarged the crevice enough so that Dapple could enter it, and led the beast through cave after cave. At last he saw a chink of light. One morning our knight was preparing himself for the approaching conflict, and was exercising his horse. En route, Rocinante was brought to a halt just above the deep hole. Don Quixote dismounted and went to investigate the chasm. As he drew near the edge, he heard a human voice, very much like that of Sancho Panza.
"Who are you below?"
he shouted.
"The most wretched of souls alive, Sancho Panza, governor, for his sins of the island of Barataria, and late squire to the famous Don Quixote,"
replied the voice. On hearing this, our knight assumed that Sancho was dead, and that it was his soul replying, held beneath the earth to do penance. Don Quixote called again.
"Surely," answered the voice from below, "it is Don Quixote who speaks." "I am he. Since through God's mercy you are in purgatory, I shall intercede for you. But tell me quickly who you really are." "I am your squire. I've never been dead. I fell into this cave last night with Dapple, who's with me now."
Dapple now began to bray. Don Quixote was then convinced that it really was Sancho alive, and set off to find help. At last, with the help of pulleys and ropes, the ass and Sancho were released. Once he had returned to the castle, Sancho gave the Duke an account of his government, and his most recent misadventure. Finally, he announced that he was giving up his office of governor, and was returning to the service of Don Quixote. The day of the promised combat finally arrived. The Duke gave his final instructions to his servant Tosilos, who was to pretend to be the peasant, and asked that the iron heads of the lances be removed for safety's sake. A great crowd had gathered at the arena. First on the field was the master of ceremonies, there to check the ground and see fair play. Next came the duennas, who were seated with a clear view of the proceedings. Finally, Don Quixote and Tosilos entered the ring, in full armor, to the blast of trumpets. Once in position, the sound of trumpets and drum rolls filled the air. At this moment, Tosilos's gaze was fixed on the duenna's daughter, and he fell in love at the sight of the girl. When the signal was given to begin, the servant remained transfixed, whilst Don Quixote advanced towards him. Tosilos shouted loudly to the marshal, "Is not this combat about whether I shall or shall not marry that young lady?" pointing at the duenna's daughter. "It is." "Then," said the servant, "I wish to withdraw and marry the girl." At this, he approached Donna Rodriguez. "I am willing, without going on with this duel, to marry your daughter." "I am released from my promise," announced Don Quixote. "Let them be married." At this point, the armor was removed from the servant. Donna Rodriguez and her daughter recognized him as one of the servants to the Duke, and not the peasant they had expected. They were furious and felt cheated by the Duke's villainy. Our knight, however, believed the transformation to be the work of enchanters, envious of his conquest. The Duke was much amused by this interpretation, and, after talking with the duenna, was able to agree to the marriage. Thus the event finished, leaving Don Quixote adjudged the victor. The spectators were disappointed that the combatants had not hacked one another to pieces. Don Quixote was tiring of the inactive life at the castle, and requested permission from the Duke and Duchess to depart. This they agreed to. The Duchess gave Sancho the letter from his wife, and the two set off in the early morning. Sancho was particularly happy, since the Duke's steward had given him 200 gold crowns to cover the expense of their journey. Altisidora, the Duke and Duchess, saw them off. Some time later the two entered a wood, but had not gone very far before Don Quixote was caught amongst some nets of green thread. As he was about to break the yarn, two beautiful girls, dressed as shepherdesses, presented themselves before them. "Stop!" commanded one of them. "Do not break our nets. You may like to know who we are and why these nets are here. Not far away is our village, which has many wealthy inhabitants. Several of us have formed a company. In this place we have invented a new Arcadia, and dress as shepherds and shepherdesses. We have tents pitched nearby. Last night we spread the nets to catch some birds. You are welcome to join us." "I approve of and admire your project," said our knight. "If I can be of any assistance, only ask, for I am in a profession which is useful to everyone. My name is none other than Don Quixote." "Goodness, what good fortune!" exclaimed the second girl.
"This man is the most valiant, loved, and courteous knight alive, and if I am not mistaken, his companion is Sancho Panza. Their story is famous."
"Absolutely right," said Sancho. "I am the jocular squire, and this gentleman is my master."
A brother of one of the girls arrived and was told the identity of the new arrivals. He too begged the knight and squire to join them, which they did. Don Quixote was given the place of honor at the head of the table. The meal over, Don Quixote announced that, by way of thanks, he would stand in the middle of the road to Saragossa and proclaim the present female company to be the most beautiful on earth, excepting his lady Dulcinea. The group tried to dissuade him, but he was adamant. At first no one came along the road, but finally a number of horsemen with lances arrived, followed by several herdsmen leading bulls. One of the herdsmen called out, "Get out of the way, or these bulls will trample you!" The knight stood firm, and gave himself no time to get out of the way of the herd. The knight, Sancho, Rocinante, and Dapple were laid out on the ground, stunned and mauled. Don Quixote shouted furiously after the drivers, who paid no attention. The knight and the squire remounted, tired and battered, and continued on their way. They stopped to clean themselves at a roadside fountain, and rested on the grass. "Sancho, if you want to do something for me while I follow your good advice and go to sleep, fetch Rocinante's bridle, and give yourself 300 or 400 lashes towards the 3,000 or so you promised to release Dulcinea from her enchantment."
"Let the lady Dulcinea have patience. I am still alive and fully intend to keep my promise."
Then the two fell asleep, waking late in the day. They reached an inn, and took lodgings for the night. Towards supper, Don Quixote went to his room while Sancho inquired after food. The innkeeper offered a mouth-watering selection of dishes. On closer questioning, however, it seemed that all he had to offer was a pair of calf's heels. Up in his room, Don Quixote overheard two guests discussing the book of the exploits of Don Quixote de la Mancha. He at once announced himself, and the two men invited the knight and the squire to dine with them. After eating, they spent much of the night in conversation. Don Quixote examined the book of his exploits, and looking through it, pronounced it both inaccurate and false. Six days later, as night fell, the two companions were resting against the trunks of cork trees. On standing, Sancho felt something brushing against his head. Trembling, the squire reached up and felt a pair of dangling legs. Looking around, all the trees seemed to have similar fruit, to judge by the shadowy forms.
"Do not be afraid," said Don Quixote. "These are the bodies of bandits, hanged for their crimes. From this evidence, I reckon we are close to Barcelona."
By daybreak, his reckoning had been proved correct. But if they were alarmed by the appearance of the dead bandits, they were more so by the sight of the 40 or so live ones who surrounded them on waking. Several approached Dapple and removed Sancho's wallet and clothes bag from the ass. Shortly, their leader approached, and looking at the sad figure of Don Quixote, said,
"Do not look so glum, sir. You are not in the hands of cruel bandits, but rather in the hands of Quixote, a man of compassion."
The knight replied,
"Understand, sir, that I am Don Quixote, whom the whole world knows. I am upset at having fallen into your hands."
The captain then asked that the belongings taken from the ass be returned, and went off. When he came back, he found his band gathered around Don Quixote, who was trying, without success, to persuade them to give up their life of crime. Quixote checked that the belongings had been returned.
"All but 3 nightcaps, which were worth a great deal,"
protested Sancho. Quixote insisted on their return, and once this had happened, he asked his men to lay out all the spoils of their recent thieving. These he then divided equally among the band. A lookout came up and told his leader that there were travellers nearby. Quixote sent a number of men to fetch them. Shortly afterwards, the travellers were brought before him, and they were searched.
"It appears," he counted, "that here we have 900 crowns and 60 guineas. My soldiers number 60, so let's see how much that makes for each."
Here he paused, and seeing the long faces of the captives, he asked for only a small proportion of their money, and let them go on their way. He turned to his men.
"Of the crowns, 2 go to each man, the other 10 to the honest squire, so that in telling of his travels he will speak well of us."
At this, all admired the captain's gallantry, generosity, and extraordinary conduct. Don Quixote and his squire spent the next 3 days and nights in the company of Quixote. The robber leader informed friends in the town of his guests, and arranged for them to meet them. At last the bandit guided Don Quixote and Sancho towards the city, and left them by a lake. Shortly afterwards, a group of soldiers, led by Don Antonio Moreno, to whom Quixote had recently written, arrived and welcomed them. The group entered the city to the sound of martial music, and were settled into their guide's house. One day, several of Moreno's friends came to dine and pay their respects to Don Quixote. The knight was flattered, and over dinner told of his recent adventures. At the end of the meal, Don Quixote was led by his hosts to a distant room. The only furniture in the room was a quartz table, and on this was set a Roman bust. "Señor Don Quixote," said Moreno, "I'll let you know one of the greatest wonders of the world, provided you can keep it secret." Don Quixote agreed at once, his curiosity aroused. "This bust, sir," said his host, "is made by a man from the East, who made it while he was a guest in this house. Tomorrow you shall witness its marvelous powers." The following day Moreno's wife invited a number of friends to a dinner and ball in honor of their guest, and in turn promised that they would be entertained by our knight. That evening 2 of the ladies invited so exhausted our knight with their continuous attention and dancing that he threw himself on the floor, where he lay shattered by his exertions. He was taken up to bed. It was therefore not until the following day that Don Antonio could prepare his experiment with the bust. With his wife, the two ladies who had been so attentive to our knight, two friends of theirs, Don Quixote and Sancho entered the room where the bust was kept. Moreno approached the enchanted bust and whispered, "Tell me, how many persons are there here?"
"Yourself, your wife, two of your lady friends, two friends of theirs, and the famous knight Don Quixote and his squire,"
said the head. All were astonished by the articulate sounds coming from the bust. Taking turns, each approached the oracle and asked questions. Our knight inquired,
"Tell me, oracle of truth, was it reality or illusion I saw in the cave of Montesinos? Will the penance of Sancho Panza release the lady Dulcinea from her enchantment?"
"What you saw in the cave,"
replied the voice from the head,
"was both true and false. Sancho's penance will be slow, but in time Dulcinea will be released."
"I am satisfied,"
stated Don Quixote. The last to come forward was Sancho.
"Shall I govern again? Will I give up being a squire? Shall I ever see my wife and children again?"
"If you return home,"
said the oracle,
"there you will be governor, and see your wife and children. And should you leave Don Quixote's service, you will cease to be a squire."
"I could have said as much myself,"
retorted Sancho. Don Quixote rebuked Sancho for his impertinence. Although everyone was amazed at this spectacle, Moreno had actually achieved the illusion by using a speaking tube fixed inside the bust, which ran to the floor below. There a man was instructed to answer the questions as he thought most appropriate. The following day a visit was arranged to view the galleys in the harbour. The shore commander and a number of his men accompanied Moreno and his guests on the tour. By chance, they happened to witness the chase and eventual capture of a Turkish vessel just off the coast. When the prize had been brought into harbour, the shore commander asked for the captain of the Turkish ship.
"This is our captain, sir,"
said one of the crew, pointing to a lady.
"Tell me," asked the commander, "what are you, Turk, Moor, or renegade?"
"None of these. I am a Christian woman. Let me briefly tell you my life story." She recounted that she had been living in Barbary, her parents having been expelled from Spain. She had been followed by Don Gregorio, who was in love with her, dressed as a woman. By chance, a passing pilgrim stopped and stared at her as she was telling her story, then rushed towards her. "Oh, Anna Felix, my daughter! I am your father, Rocote." At this name, Sancho recognized the pilgrim he had met not long before. Rocote then, in his turn, began his story. "I left my birthplace some years ago to seek safety abroad. I settled in Germany, but returned to Spain to collect my property and find my daughter. Now I am indeed fortunate to have collected both." His daughter then explained that Don Gregorio was now a captive of the Moors. Her father offered more than 2,000 crowns to pay the ransom, and arranged with one of the renegades present to take a crew of Christians and rescue Don Gregorio. Some days later, Don Quixote came across a knight. The knight addressed him. "Illustrious knight, I am the Knight of the White Moon. I have come here to engage you in combat in order to make you confess, should you live, that my mistress is more beautiful than your Lady Dulcinea." "Knight of the White Moon, I have not heard of you, or of your achievements, and I swear that you could not have seen my Lady Dulcinea. If you had, you would not dare to suggest that your mistress is the more beautiful. Your claims are lies, and I accept your challenge. Choose your ground." At this moment, Don Antonio and a number of others arrived on the scene. No one knew the strange knight, and watched the encounter with interest. The Knight of the White Moon, being seated on the faster horse, quickly attacked our knight, throwing him to the ground. The knight looked down on Don Quixote. "I will not take your life. All I demand of the great Don Quixote is that he submit to 1 year's rest at home and give up travelling under arms." Our knight promised to do as he was instructed. At this, the Knight of the White Moon rode off towards the city, with Don Antonio in pursuit, eager to discover his identity. Meanwhile, the vanquished Don Quixote was carried away in a chair to Don Antonio's house. Some distance off, Moreno caught up with the knight, and demanded to know who he was. "My name is Carrasco. I have been pursuing Don Quixote in an attempt to force him to return home, which I feel to be in his best interest." For 6 days Don Quixote remained in bed, comforted by Sancho.
"Come on, it's time you were up and packed, though it's a pity to think that I may never be a count or an earl."
"Peace, Sancho. My retirement is only for a year. After that I shall resume my adventures, and then I shall win a kingdom for myself, and an earldom for you." The two were cheered by the arrival of a messenger, with news of the successful release and safe return of Don Gregorio. 2 days later, Don Quixote set out for home. Sancho trudged after him on foot, since Dapple now carried his master's armour. On the way they met up with Tosilos, the duke's servant, who told his tale.
"No sooner had you left me than, rather than gaining a wife, I got a thrashing from the duke for not obeying his orders. In the end, the girl was sent off to a nunnery, and Donna Rodriguez packed off to Castile. I'm now on my way to deliver a packet of letters from my duke to Barcelona."
The two of them took their leave, and came to the place where they had been trampled by the bulls. Our knight mused out loud to Sancho that the two of them should become shepherds, called Quixotics and Panzino. Warming to the subject, they then came up with new names for their friends, who should join them as shepherds. Eventually, the two settled down to sleep. Towards the evening on the following day, they spied a band of heavily armed men approaching. The horsemen soon came up, surrounding them, and declaring the two prisoners. Under heavy guard, and surrounded by insults, the two were led to their unknown destination. An hour after nightfall, the procession came to a halt at a castle. Don Quixote recognized it as that belonging to the Duke, their recent host. "How surprising! On being overcome, good is changed to bad, and bad to worse," exclaimed the knight. The pair were led into a courtyard, in the middle of which was a trestle, where a body was laid out. Surrounding them were the Duke and Duchess, and all the members of their household. Don Quixote looked again at the corpse, and recognized Altisidora laid out before him. Under guard, Sancho was dressed in a costume which had a flame design, and a mitre painted with devils was put on his head. He was then tied down to stakes, and pinched and slapped by a number of duennas. The victim cried out, "Away! Do you think I'm made of brass, and cannot feel the pain?" At that moment the body of Altisidora turned, and sat up. The whole assembly cried, "She lives! She lives!" "Oh, Sancho," said Altisidora, "the kindest and the best of squires, thank you for the life I now enjoy." The knight and the squire were then greeted by the Duke and Duchess, and given the rooms they had had on their previous visit. The story goes that the scholar Carrasco had visited the castle before and after the encounter with Don Quixote, and the Duke had arranged for the spectacular disenchantment of Altisidora. Don Quixote and Sancho left the castle the following day. Our knight considered the resurrection of Altisidora once again.
Sancho, if I paid you to disenchant Dulcinea, would you start at once? Just name your price.
Master, I am ready at once, at the price of, say, a shilling for each stroke. I reckon the total ought to be 825 guineas. I'll start this very evening.
Don Quixote agreed to his proposal. That night, after supper in the open, Sancho made himself a whip from Dapple's halter. Then, standing some distance from his master, he stripped himself to the waist. Don Quixote called out that he would double his offer if Sancho could accomplish the task without complaint. Sancho agreed. The sly knave then took to thrashing the trees instead of himself. Don Quixote called out, "Stop! Stop! Stop now! This action seems much too violent." Sancho stopped, and after a long sleep, the two rode on. Over the next 2 days, Sancho completed his penance, using the trees as before, rather than his own back. Each time, his master counted the strokes at a distance. On completion of his penance, Don Quixote eagerly awaited the arrival of the Lady Dulcinea. He peered very closely at all the women they came across, in case one happened to be his lady. At last, they reached the outskirts of their own village. The priest and Carrasco came up to meet them, followed by many children. Teresa and Sancha ran up to Sancho and demanded to know what he had brought with him.
Let us go home. There you will hear wonders. I've made some money, too.
The three left. Don Quixote returned to the care of his housekeeper, Niece. He told his adventures to the priest and Carrasco, and of his new determination to be a shepherd. The friends humoured the knight. No sooner had his friends left him than the housekeeper and Niece, who had been listening to the conversation, came up to him. "Bless me, uncle," cried Don Quixote's niece, "what has now got into your head? We thought you were coming home to stay and live a quiet life. Now you propose to turn shepherd." The housekeeper chipped in, "Sire, how would you bear the summer heat and the winter cold? Shepherding is for men who are born and bred to it. Take my advice. Stay at home. Look after your estate. Give it to the poor, and go to confession regularly. If any problem arises from following this advice, bring it to me." "Peace," replied Don Quixote. "I know my duty. Just help me to bed, as I'm not feeling too well. If I'm to be a knight-errant or shepherd, I'll continue to look after you." The two carried him to bed, brought him food, and looked after him in every imaginable way. During his illness, his friends visited, and his trusty squire Sancho never left his bedside. They endeavoured to revive his flagging spirits, supposing his recent defeat and disappointment, after all the hopes he had had for Dulcinea, were the cause of his illness. Before long, Don Quixote expressed a wish to sleep, and asked to be left alone. On waking, he cried, "Praise be to Almighty God, who has given me so great a blessing." The niece, who had noticed that her uncle had, during his illness, regained his senses, asked, "What are you saying, sire? Has something extraordinary happened?" "Good niece," replied Don Quixote, "my judgment is now clear, and freed from the dark clouds brought about by reading those detestable books of chivalry,
I now see my extravagance and foolishness, and I'm sorry that this realization has come so late, leaving me with no time to study those books which would have improved and enlightened my soul. Since I feel at the point of death, I would be obliged if you could call my friends, since I wish to make my confession and my will."
On seeing his friends again, he greeted them.
"Give me joy. I am no longer Don Quixote de la Mancha, but plain Senor Quixote again. I now see the histories of knight-errantry as foolish. I am no longer interested in them."
The friends imagined that some new frenzy had seized him, and to humour him, announced that not only had they news of Dulcinea's disenchantment, but that they too were considering becoming shepherds. They advised him to become himself again, and to forget about the stories.
"The stories indeed proved unfortunate. I feel that death approaches, so let us be serious. Bring me a confessor and a notary to draw up my will,"
asked Don Quixote. The friends looked at each other, and, although dubious about this sudden change from madness to sanity, agreed to make the arrangements. Don Quixote then talked again in so rational and Christian a manner that all were convinced of his perfect recovery of intellect. The priest requested that he be left alone with Don Quixote to hear his confession. On its completion, the friends, in a tearful state, went in to see Don Quixote. The notary now entered the room, and wrote the will. On coming to the distribution of his worldly goods, he instructed the notary to write as follows.
Item: It is my will that to Sancho Panza, who I believe has certain sums of mine in his possession, he will not be called to account for the receipts or bills from me. Rather, once he has paid himself, any remainder shall be his. If I could procure him an island or a kingdom, I would readily do so, for by his simplicity of heart and honesty he deserves it."
Turning to Sancho, he said,
"Forgive me for deluding you, and persuading you to believe that there are still knights errant in this world of ours."
"Alas, good sir,"
replied Sancho,
"do not die, I pray you. Take my advice, and live many years more. Don't be idle. Get up, and let us go to the country dressed as shepherds. If you feel upset at being defeated, blame me, since I hadn't properly tied Rocinante's saddle. You must know from the books of chivalry that the defeat of knights is by no means uncommon, and that he who is defeated today may well be the conqueror tomorrow."
"Gentlemen,"
said Don Quixote,
"let us proceed. I was mad. I am now sane. I cannot look back. I was Don Quixote de la Mancha. I am now, as I was christened, Alfonso Quixote the Good."
He continued,
"I bequeath to my niece, Antonia Quixote, all my estate, real and personal, after the payment of debts and legacies. Included in these will be the wages due to my housekeeper for the time she has been in my service, as well as 20 crowns for the mourning clothes. I appoint as executors the priest and the bachelor Carrasco, here present. If my niece wishes to marry, it must be to a man who has no knowledge of books of chivalry.
Finally, I ask that my executors, when they come across the author of a history called The Exploits of Don Quixote de la Mancha, they, in my name, request his forgiveness for having unwittingly given him the material for the many absurdities that are in the book. I thus depart this life with a burden on my conscience for having caused the publication of so much foolishness. With this he ended his will, and, fainting, stretched out on his bed, to the alarm of all present. However, he survived a further 3 days, and at last, after receiving the sacrament, Don Quixote's last moment arrived. The notary present declared that he had never read of any knight-errant dying in so composed and Christian a manner as Don Quixote. And here ended the history of the gentleman of La Mancha, whose birthplace has been concealed, so that all the towns and villages of the province could claim the honor of having produced him.